Like I said, I never asked you to come. Damn, Adrian cursed as he removed his weapons and talked to them carefully on the saddle of his horse. Careful, Royce leaned over and told him he's old, but he looks tough. Hadron ran full tilt at the old farmer and tackled him to the ground. Theron was larger than Hadron, with powerful arms and hands made strong by years of unending work, but Hadrian was fast and agile. The two grappled in a wrestling match that had them rolling in the dirt, grunting as each tried to get the advantage. This is so stupid, Adrian muttered, getting to his feet. If you just get on the horse, you get on the horse. Get out of here and leave me alone, Theron yelled at them as he struggled to catch his breath, standing bent over, hands resting on his knees. Maybe you can help me this time, Adrian said to Royce. Royce rolled his eyes and dismounted. I didn't expect you'd have so much trouble. It's not easy to subdue a person bigger than you and not hurt him in the process. Well, I think I found your problem. Then why don't we try hurting him? When they turned back to face Theron, the farmer had a good-sized stick in his hand and a determined look in his eyes. Adrian sighed. I don't think we have a choice, Daddy, Trey shouted, running into the ring of firelight, her face streaked with tears. Daddy, she cried again, and reaching the old man threw her arms around him. Bryce, what are you doing here? Theron yelled. It's not safe. I came to get you. I'm staying here. He pulled his daughter off and pushed her away. Now you take your hired thugs and get back to the Botherwicks right now. You hear me? No, Trace cried at him, her arms raised, still reaching. I won't leave you, Thrace. He bellowed, his huge frame towering over her. I am your father, and you do as I say. No, she shouted back at him, the firelight shining on her wet cheeks. I won't leave you to die. You can whip me if you want, but you'll have to come back to the castle to do it, you stupid little fool, he cursed. You're gonna get yourself killed. Don't you know that I don't care? Her voice ran shrill, her hands crushed into fists, arms punched down at her sides. What reason do I have to live if my own father, the only person I have left in the world, hates me so much he would rather die than look at me? Theron stood stunned. At first she began in a quaking voice, I thought you wanted to make sure no one else was killed, and then I thought maybe it was, I don't know, to put their souls to rest. Then I thought you wanted revenge. Maybe the hate was eating you up. Maybe you had to see it killed. But none of that's true. You just want to die. You hate yourself. You hate me. There's nothing in this world for you anymore. Nothing you care about. I don't hate you there. And said you do. Because it was my fault. I know what they meant to you. And I wake up every morning with that. She wiped the tears enough to see if it was me. It would have been just like it was with Mom. You would have driven a stick into Stony Hill with my name on it, and the next day gone back to work. You would have driven the plow and thanked Maribor for his kindness and sparing your son. I should have been the one to die. But I can't change what happened, and your death won't bring him back. Nothing will still. If all I can do now, if all that's left for me is to die here with you, then that's what I'll do. I won't leave you, Daddy. I can't, I just can't. She fell to her knees exhausted and in a fragile voice said, we'll all be together again at least then. As if in response to her words, the wood around them went silent once more. This time the crickets and frogs stopped so abruptly the silence seemed suddenly loud. No, Baron said, shaking his head. He looked up at the night sky. No. The farmer grabbed his daughter and lifted her up. We're going. He turned. Help us. Adrian pulled Millie around. Up, both of you. Millie stomped her hooves and started to pull and twist, nostrils flaring, ears twitching. Adrian gripped her by the bit and held tight. Theron mounted the horse and pulled Thrace up in front of him. Then with a swift kick he sent Millie racing up the trail back toward the village. Royce slept on the back of Mouse and throwing at a hand swung Hadrian up behind him. Even as he sent the horse galloping into the night, the horses needed no urging as they ran full out with the sweat of fear damping their coats. Their hooves thundered, pounding the earth like violent drum beats. The path ahead was only slightly lighter than the rest of the wood, and for Hadrian it was often a blur as the wind drew tears from his eyes above. U.S. Royce shouted overhead. They heard a rush of movement in the leaves. The horses made a jarring turn into the thick of the wood. Invisible branches, leaves, and pine bars slapped them, whipped them, beat them. The animals raced in blind panic. They drove through the underbrush, glancing off tree trunks, bouncing by branches. Adrian felt Royce duck and mimiced him. Thump, thump, thump. He could hear a slow beating overhead, a dull deep pumping. A blast of wind came from above, a massive downdraft of air. Along with it came the frightening sounds of cracking, snapping, splintering. The treetops shattered and exploded. Log Royce shattered. As the horses jumped, Hagen kept his seat only by virtue of Royce's agile grab. In the darkness he heard Thrace's scream, a grunt, and a sounds like an axe handle hitting wood. The thief reined Mouse hard, wrestling with her, pulling the animal's head around. As she reared and snorted, Adrian could hear Millie galloping ahead. "What's going on?" Adrian asked. "They fell," Royce growled. "I can't see them." Adrian leapt down in the thickets. "They're to your right," Royce said, climbing off Mass, who was in a panic, thrashing her head back and forth. "Here," Karen said, his voice labored over. Here the farmer stood over his daughter. She lay unconscious, sprawled, and twisted. Blood dripped from her nose and mouth. "She hit a branch," Theron said, his voice was shaking, frightened. I didn't see the log." "Get her on my horse," Voice commanded Theron. "Take her and ride for the manor. We're close. You can see the light of the bonfires burning." The farmer made no protest. He climbed on Mouse, who was still stomping and snorting. Adrian picked up Thrace. A patch of moonlight showed a dark blemish on her face, a long wide mark. He lifted her. Her head fell back limp. Her arms and legs dangled free. "She seems dead." He handed her to Theron, who cradled his daughter to his chest and held her tight. Royce let loose the bit, and the horse thundered off, racing for the open field, leading Royce and Adrian behind. "Take Millie's around," Agent whispered. "I think Millie is already an appetizer. I suppose the good news is that she bought fries in fair and safe passage." They slowly moved to the edge of the wood. They were very close to where Dylan and his boys had been hauling logs earlier that day. They could see 3 of the 6 bonfires blazing away, illuminating the field. "What about us?" Royce asked. "Do you think the Gillarabran knows we're still in here?" Ezra Hardin said. "It was intelligent, so I presume it can count. Then it'll come back and find us. We have to reach the castle. The distance across the open is about 100 feet. About that was confirmed." "I guess we can hope it's still munching on Millie." "Ready, run, spread out so it can't get both of us." "Go." The grass was slick with dew and filled with stumps and pits. Hadron got only a dozen yards before falling on his face. "Stay behind me," Royce told him. "I thought we were spreading out." "That's before I remembered you're blind." They ran again, dodging in and out as Royce picked the path up the hillside. They were nearly halfway across when they heard the bellows again. Thump, thump. The sound rushed toward them. Looking up, Hadrian saw something dark pass across the face of the rising moon, a serpent with bat-like wings gliding, arcing, circling like a hawk hunting mice in a field. The bellows stopped its diving. Roy shouted. A massive burst of wind blew them to the ground. The bonfires were instantly snuffed out. A second later, a loud rumble shook the earth, and a monolithic wall of green fire exploded in a great ring surrounding the entire hill. Astounding flames 30 feet high flashed up like trees of light, spewing intense heat. No longer having any trouble seeing his way, Adrian jumped to his feet and sped to the gate, Royce on his heels behind them. The flames roared above them. They heard a chilling scream. Dylan, Vince, and Russell slammed the gate shut the instant they were inside. The bonfire in the courtyard, which had been unlit so far, startled everyone as it exploded into a brilliant blue-green flame reaching like a pillar into the sky. Once more from the darkness above, the Galara Bryn screamed at them. The emerald inferno slowly burned down. The flames lost their green color and diminished until only natural flames remained. The fires crackled and hissed, sending storms of sparks skyward. The men in the courtyard stared upward, but there were no further signs of the beast, only darkness and the distant sound of crickets. Chapter 6. The contest. "I can assure you, Your Royal Majesty," Arista said in her most congenial voice, "there will be no change in foreign or domestic policy under King Ulrich's reign. He will continue to pursue the same agenda as our father, upholding the dignity and honor of the House of Essendon. Malanga will continue to remain your friendly neighbor to the west." Arista stood before the King of Dunmore in a mother's best dress. The stunning silver silk gown, 40 buttons lined the sleeves, dozens of feet of crushed velvet trimmed the embroidered bodice and full skirt. The rounded neckline clung to her shoulders. Sister direct, chin high, eyes forward, hands folded. King Rossward, who sat on his throne wearing furs that looked to have come from wolves, drained his cup and belched. He was short and immensely fat. His round pudgy face sagged under its own weight, gathering at the bottom and forming 3 full chins. His eyes were half closed, his lips were wet, and she was certain she could see a bit of spittle dribbling down. Through the folds of his neck his wife Frida sat beside him. She too was large, but thin by comparison. Whereas the king seeped liquid, she was dry as a desert in both looks and manner. The throne room was small, with a wooden floor and beams that supported a lofty cathedral ceiling. Protruding from the walls were heads of stags and moose, each covered in enough dust to make its fur look gray. Near the door stood the famous 9-foot stuffed bear named Oswald, its claws up, mouth open. Snarling Dunmore legend held that Oswald killed 5 knights and an unknown number of peasants before King Ogden, King Roswell's grandfather, slew him with nothing more than a dagger that had been 70 years earlier, when Glamrander was just a frontier fort and Dunmore little more than a forest with trails. Roswert himself couldn't claim such glory. He had abandoned the hunting traditions of his sires in favor of courtly life, and it showed. The king held up his cup and shook it. Arista waited, and the king yawned. Somewhere behind her loud heels crossed the throne room. There was a muttering, then the heels again, followed by the snapping of fingers. Finally a figure approached the deish, thin and delicate. An elf. He was dressed in a rough woolen uniform of dull brown. Around his neck was a heavy iron collar that was riveted in place. He approached with a pitcher and filled the king's cup, then backed away. The king drank, tipping the cup to high wine, dribbling down, leaving a faint pink line and a droplet dangling from his stubbly whiskers. He belched again, this time more loudly, and sighed with contentment. The king looked back at Arista. But what about this matter of Braga's death? Roswert asked. Do you have evidence to show that he was involved in this so-called conspiracy? He tried to kill me, yes, so you say, but even if he did, he had good reason. It seems, Brag, I was a good and devout Nephron, and you are after all a witch. Arista squeezed her hands together. It was not for the first time, and her fingers were starting to ache. Forgive me, your royal majesty, but I fear you may be misinformed on that subject. Misinformed? I have. He coughed again, then spat on the floor beside the throne. Frida glared rigidly at the elf until he stepped over and wiped it up with the bottom of his tunic. I have very good information gatherers, the king went on, who tell me both Braga and Bishop Solo brought you to trial to answer charges of witchcraft and the murder of your father. Immediately afterwards, Braga was dead, decapitated, and accused of the very charges he leveled against you. Now you'll come before us as ambassador of Melanga, a woman. I fear this is all too convenient for my tastes. Braga also accused me of killing His Royal Majesty King Ulrich, who appointed me to this office. Or do you also deny his existence? The royal eyebrows rose. You are young, he said coldly. This is your first audience as ambassador. I'll ignore your upfront this time. Insult me again, and I'll have you expelled from my kingdom. Arista bowed her head silently. It does not bode well with us that the throne of Melanga was taken by blood, nor that House Essendon pays only lip service to the church. Also, your kingdom's tolerance for elves is disgusting. You let the vile beast run free. Now run. Never meant for this to be. The church teaches us that the elf is a disease. They must be broken into service or vanquished altogether. They are like rats. Melanger is the wood pile next door. Yes, I have no doubt that Ulrich will continue his father's policies. Both were born with blinders. Changes are coming, and I can already see that Melangari is too foolish to bend with the wind. All the better for Dunmore, I think. Arista opened her mouth, but the king held up a finger. This interview is over. Go back to your brother and tell him we fulfilled the favor of seeing you and were not impressed. The king and queen stood together and walked out through the rear archway, leaving Arista facing to empty wooden chairs. The elf, which stood nearby, watched her intently, but said nothing. She half considered going on with the rest of her prepared speech. The level of futility would remain. Empty thrones could not be any less responsive, and most certainly would be more polite. She sighed, her shoulders drooped. Could it have gone any worse? She turned and walked out, listening to her beautiful dress rustling. She stepped outside the castle gate and looked down at the city. Deep baked ruts scarred the uneven dirt roads, so rough and littered with rocks they appeared as dry river beds, sun bleached. The tight rows of similarly framed wooden buildings, to a pale gray. Most of the residents wore drab colors clothes made of undyed wool or linen. Dozens of people with weary faces sat on corners or wandered about aimlessly with hands out. They appeared invisible to those walking by. It is Arista's first visit to Glamour, the capital of Dunmore. She shook her head and muttered softly, "We have seen you too." Despite the meager offerings, the city was bustling, but she suspected few of those rushing by were locals. It was easy to tell the difference. Those from out of town wore shoes. Wagons, carriages, coaches, and horses flowed through the center of the capital. That morning, all heading east. The church had opened. The contest to all commerce, common and noble alike. It was the shot of glory, wealth, and fame. Her own coach waited, flying the Maylonger Falcon, and Hilfred stood holding the door. Bernice sat inside, with a tray of sweets on her lap and a smile on her lips. "How did it go, my dear? Were you impressive?" "No, I wasn't impressive, but we are also not at war, so I should thank Maribor for that kindness." She sat opposite Bernice, making certain to pull the full length of her gown inside the door before Hilfred closed it. "Have a gingerbread man?" Bernice asked, holding up the tray with a look of pity that included pushing out her lower lip. "He's bound to steal the pain away." "Where's Sally?" she asked, seeing the man-shaped cookies. "He said he had some things to speak to the Archbishop about, and would ride in his Grace's coach. He hoped you didn't mind." Arista did not mind, and only wished Bernice had joined him. She was tired of the constant company and missed the solitude of her tower. She took a cookie and felt the carriage rock as Hilfred climbed up with the driver. The coach lurched, and they were off, bouncing over the rutted road. "These are stale," Aristo said with a mouthful of gingerbread that was hard and sandy. Bernice looked horrified. "I'm so sorry. Where did you get them?" "A little bakery up." She started to point out the window, but the movement of the carriage confused her. She looked around and gave up and put her hand down again. "Oh, I don't know now, but it was a very nice shop, and I thought you might need, something to help you feel better after the meeting." "Need them?" Benny nodded her head with a forced smile, and reaching out, she patted the princess's hand and said, "It's not your fault, dear. It really isn't fair of His Majesty to put you in this position. I should stay in Medford and receive suitors." "Aristoguest, exactly. This just isn't right. Neither is this cookie." She placed the gingerbread man back on the tray minus the legs she'd bitten off. She then sat raking her tongue with her upper teeth like a cat with hair in its mouth. "At least His Royal Majesty must have been impressed by how you looked." Then he said, eyeing her with pride, "You're beautiful." Arista gave her a sidelong glance. "The dress is beautiful." "Of course it is. But oh dear, Maribor." Arista cut her off as she glanced out the window. "How many are there now? It'll be like traveling with an army." As the carriage reached the end of town, she saw the masses. There could be as many as 300 men standing behind the banners of the Nephon Church. They all waited in a single line, but they couldn't have been more different. The muscular, scrawny, tall, and short, all ranks were represented: knights, soldiers, nobles, and peasants. Some wore armor, some silk, others linen or wool. They sat on chargers, draft horses, ponies, mules, or inside coaches, open-air carriages, wagons, and buckboards. They appeared a strange and unlikely assortment, but each bore the same smile of expectation and excitement, all eyes looking east. Arista's first official session as ambassador was finished. As bad as it had been, it was over. With Sally gone, she could shall thoughts of church and state, guilt and blame, stress that had smothered her for days evaporated, and at last she was able to feel the growing excitement that bubbled all around her. From everywhere, people rushed to join the growing train. Some arrived with nothing but a small linen bag tucked under one arm, while others led their own personal train of pack horses. There were those who commanded multiple wagons loaded with tense food and clothes. One well-dressed merchant carried velvet upholstered chairs and a canopy bed on top of a wagon. A loud banging hammered the roof of the coach, shocking both of them. Gingerbread man flew. "Oh dear," Bernice gasped. A moment later, Marvin Pickering's head appeared in the window, looking down and inside from the back of his horse so that his dark hair hung wildly. "So how did it go?" He grinned mischievously. "Do I need to prepare for war?" Arista scowled. "That good, huh?" Marvin went on, heedless of the commotion he had caused. "We'll talk later. I have to find Fannin before he starts dueling someone." "Hi, Alfred. This is going to be great. When was the last time we were all camping together?" "See you." Bernice was fanning herself with both hands, staring up the roof of the Coach her mouth slack seeing her, and the little army of gingerbread man scattered on the benches, and the curtains on the floor, and in her lap Arista couldn't help smiling. You are right, Bernice, the cookies did cheer me up. See him fannin'. Pointed to the man in the brown suede doublet, that surrender possibly the greatest living night, after Subriton, after another day's travel, that left her drowsy. Arista was at the Pickerings' camp hiding from Bernice. The two boys shared an elegant single-pick tent of alternating gold and green stripes, which they had pitched at the eastern edge of the main camp. The three sat out front, under the scallop-edged canopy held up by two tall wooden poles. On the left flew the gold falcon on the red field of the House of Essendon, on the right the gold sword on the green field of the House of Pickering. It was a modest camp compared to most of the nobles. Some looked like small castles, and took hours for a team of servants to erect. The Pickerings traveled lightly, carrying everything they needed on their stallions, and to pack horses they didn't have tables or chairs, and Aristo sprawled in a modest gown on a sheet of canvas. If Bernice saw the old woman would have a heart attack. Arista didn't mind. She thought it was wonderful to lie back and stretch out under the sky. It reminded her of summer's rule when they were kids. At night the adults would dance, and the children would lie on the south hill of the Pickerings' home of Drondle Fields, counting the falling stars and fireflies. It had been all of them, then Marvin, Fannin, Ulrich, even Linner back before the boy's sister became too much of a lady. She remembered the feel of the cool night breeze rushing over her, the sensation of grass on her bare feet, the vast spray of stars above, and the faint melody of the band as it played K-Lead Portmore, the Galilean folk song. And there see the large man in the green tunic. That's Sir Graven. He's a quester. He does most of his work for the Church of Nephron. You know, recovering artifacts, slaying monsters, those kinds of things. He's known to be one of the greatest adventurers alive. He's from Vernus, that's all the way down near Delgos. I know where Vinda is. Fannin, Arista replied. That's right, you have to know all that stuff. Now don't you? Marvin said. Your high exalted ambassadorship. The elder Pickering offered an elaborate seated bow. Laugh now, just you wait, she told him. You'll get yours one day. You'll be Marquis, then it won't be all fun and games. You'll have responsibilities, mister. I won't. Fan, and said sadly, if not for his being 3 years younger. Fannin could be Marvin's twin. Both had the dashing Pickering features, sharp angled faces, dark thick hair, bright white teeth, and sweeping shoulders that tapered to narrow athletic waist. Fannin was just leaner and a bit shorter, and unlike Marvin, whose hair was always a frightful mess, Fannin kept his neatly combed. That's why you need to win this thing, Marvin told his brother. And of course you will, because you're a Pickering, and Pickerings never fail. Look at that guy over there. He doesn't stand a chance. Arista didn't bother sitting up. He'd been doing this all night, pointing out people and explaining how he could tell by the way they walked or wore their swords that Fannin could best them. She'd no doubt he was right. She was just tired of hearing it. What is the price for this contest? She asked. They haven't said yet, Fan, and muttered. Gold, most likely, Marvin replied, in the form of some award. But that's not what makes it valuable. It's the prestige. Once Fannin takes this trophy, he'll have a name. Well, he already has the Pickering name, but he hasn't any titles yet. Once he does, opportunities will open up for him. Of course, it could be land, then he'd be set. I hope so. I certainly don't want to end up in a monastery. Do you still write poetry? Fannin, Arista asked. I haven't in a while. It was good, but I remember at least he used to write all the time. What happened? He learned the poetry of the sword. It'll serve him far better than the pen. Marvin answered for him. Who's that? Fan and asked, pointing to the west. That's Retinal, Marvin replied, the self-proclaimed genius. Get this, he's brought this thing, a huge contraption, with him. Why? He says it's for the contest. What is it? Marvin shrugged. Don't know, but it's big. He keeps it covered under a top and wails like a girl whenever the wagon team bounces it through a rut. Say, isn't that Prince Rudolph? Where Arista popped her head up, moving to her elbows. Marvin chuckled. Just kidding. All right, told us about your misunderstanding. Have you met Rudolph? She asked. Actually, I have. Marvin said. The man has donkeys, wondering why they got stuck with him as a namesake. It took a second, then Fannin and Arista broke into laughter, dragging Marvin with them. He's a royal git, that's certain. and I'd have been plenty upset if I thought I was facing a life kissing that ass. Honestly, Arista, I'm surprised you didn't turn Ulrich into a toad or something. Arista stopped laughing. What you? No, put a hex on him, a weak as a frog would. What's wrong? Nothing, she said, lying back down and turning onto her stomach. Hey look, I didn't mean anything, it's okay, she lied. It was just a joke. Your first joke was better, Arista. I know you're not a witch. A long, uncomfortable silence followed. I'm sorry, Marvin offered. Took you long enough, she said. It could have been worse. Fanon spoke up. Ari could have forced you to marry Marvin. That's really sick, Arista said, rolling over and sitting up. Marvin looked at her with hurt, surprised eyes. She shook her head. I just meant it would be like marrying a brother. I've always thought of you all as family. Don't tell Danik, Marvin replied. He's had a crush on you for years. Seriously, oh, and don't tell him I told you either. A better yet, just forget I said that. What about those two? Fan and asked abruptly, pointing toward a massive red and black striped tent from which two men had just exited. One was huge with a wild red mustache and beard. He wore a sleeveless scarlet tunic with a green draped sash and a metal cap with several dents in it. The other man was tall and thin with long black hair and a short trimmed beard. He was dressed in a red cassock and black cape with the symbol of a broken crown on his chest. I don't think you want to mess with either of them, Marvin finally said. That's Lord Rufus of Trent, warlord of Lingard, a clan leader and veteran of dozens of battles against the wild men of Estrander, not to mention being the hero of the Battle of Villan Hills. That's Rufus. Fan and muttered, I heard he's got the timberland of a shrew, the arm of a bear. Who's the other guy? The one with the broken crown standard. Fanon asked, pointing at the other man. That, my dear brother, is a sentinel, and let's just hope this is the closest either of us ever get to one. While Arista was watching the two men, she saw a silhouette appear against the light of the distant campfire, very short with a long beard and puffy sleeves. By the way, I want to start early tomorrow, Fanon, his brother said. I want to get out ahead of the train. I'm tired of eating dust. Anyone know exactly where we're going? Fan and asked. It feels like we're traveling to the end of the world, Arista nodded. I heard Sally talking about it with the Archbishop. I think it's a little village called Dalgren. She looked back, trying to find the figure once more, but it was gone. Chapter 7 of Elves and Men. Grace lay on the Margrave's bed in the manor house, her head carefully wrapped in strips of cloth. Her hair was punched and snarled, blonde strands slipping out between the bandages. Purple and yellow bruises swelled around her eyes and nose. Her upper lip puffed up to twice its size, and a line of dark dried blood ran its length. Thrice coughed and mumbled, but never spoke, never opened her eyes, and Theron never left her side. Ezra Harden ordered Lena to boil feverfew leaves in a big pot of apple cider vinegar. She did as he instructed. Everyone did now. After the previous night, the residents of Dalgren treated the cripple with newfound respect and looked at them with awe and a bit of fear. It was Todd Bothwig and Rose McDorn who had seen him raise the green fire that had chased away the beast. No one said the word witch or wizard. No one had to. Soon the steam from the pot filled the room with a pungent, flowery odor. I'm so sorry, Theron whispered to his daughter. The coughing and mumbling had stopped, and she lay as still as death. He held her limp hands to his cheek, unsure if she could hear him. He'd been saying that for hours, begging her to wake up. I didn't mean it. I was just so angry. I'm so sorry. Don't leave. Please come back to me. He could still hear the sound, and the dark of his daughter's cry cut horribly short by a muffled crack. If it had been a tree trunk or a thicker branch thereon, guessed she would have died instantly. As it was, she still might die. No one but Lena and Ezra Harden dared enter the room that Theron filled with his grief. They all expected the worst. Blood had covered the girl's face and her father's shirt. By the time they arrived at the manor, skin-white lips and odd bluish hue, Thrace hadn't moved nor opened her eyes. Ezra Harden had whispered to her and instructed them to take the girl to the manor and keep her warm. It was the kind of thing one did for the dying, making the most comfortable as possible. Deacon Thomas had prayed for her and remained on hands to bless her departing soul. In the past year, the village of Dargren had seen many deaths. Not all were by the beast. There Where the normal accidents and sicknesses and in winter wolves hunted the area, there were also some unexplained disappearances often attributed to the beast. They could just as likely have been the result of getting lost in the forest or accidentally falling in the mid-Walden. In no more than a year, over half the village's population had perished, gone missing. Everyone knew someone who had died, and nearly every family had lost at least one member. The people of Dologram had grown accustomed to death. He was a nightly visitor, a guest at every breakfast table, then knew his face, the sound of his voice, the way he walked, his peculiar habits. He was always there. If it weren't for the mess he left, they might neglect to notice him altogether. No unexpected thrace to survive. The sun came up, casting a dull light into the room where Theron wept for his daughter. The last of his family was leaving him. Only now he realized how much she meant to him. Thoughts came uninvited to his mind. Time and time again it had been. She would always come for him. He remembered the night the beast attacked his farm when he was coming home late. Only she had braved the darkness to search for him. It was Thrace, a young girl, little more than a child, who traveled alone halfway across Avon and spent her life savings to bring him help. Then the previous night, when a stubbornness had kept him at the farm, she had come to him in the darkness, running alone through the forest, ignoring the dangers. There had been only one thought in her mind: to save him. She had succeeded. She deprived the beast of his flesh. But more than that, she'd pulled him back into the world of the living. She had ripped the black veil away from his eyes and freed his heart from the weight of guilt. But the price had been her life. Tears ran down his cheeks. They hung on his upper lip. He kissed his daughter's hand, leaving a wet spot and offering an apology. How could I have been so blind? The even constant breaths his daughter took slowed with each inhale, less frequent, shorter than the one before. He listened to their descent, but the sound of footsteps receding, walking away, growing fainter, quieter. He clutched her hand, kissing it repeatedly and rubbing it to his wet cheek. It felt like his heart was being ripped out through his chest. At last, the regular pace of her breathing stopped. Theron sobbed, "Oh God, Daddy." He jerked his head up. His daughter's eyes were open. She was looking at him. "Are you all right?" she whispered. His mouth opened, but he couldn't speak. His tears continued to flow. And like a barren bit of land seeing water for the first time in years, a smile of joy grew on his face. Swift clouds moved across a capricious sky as growing winds and the importance of a coming storm marked the new day. Royce sat on the rock ledge where the cliff met the river, and the spray of the falls dampened the stone. His feet and legs were soaked from a morning spent trekking through the damp forest underbrush. His eyes stared out across the ridgeline of the falls, of the promontory rock and the towering citadel that sat tantalizingly upon it. He thought that perhaps there might be a tunnel running under the river. He looked for an access in the trees, but found nothing. He was getting nowhere. After almost 2 days, he was no closer to his goal. The tower still lay out of reach unless he could learn to swim the current, walk on water, or fly. He had no chance of traversing the gulf that lay between there. Over there right now. "You know, Ezra Hardin," said Royce, had forgotten about the wizard he had arrived sometime earlier, mentioning only that Thrace had survived, was awake, and looked to make a full recovery. After that, he took a seat on a rock and spent the next hour or so staring across the river, much as Royce had done all day. Who the elves there on their side of the river, looking back at us. They can see us, I suspect. Even at this range, they're surprising, like that most humans consider them inferior, lazy, filthy, uneducated creatures. But the fact is they are superior to humans in nearly every way. I suppose that's why humans are so quick to denounce them. They're unwilling to concede that they may be second best. Elves are truly remarkable. Just look at that tower. It's fluid and seamless, as if growing right out of the rock. How elegant. How perfect it fits into the landscape, like a thing of nature, a natural wonder. Only it isn't. They created it using skills and techniques that our best masons couldn't begin to understand. Just imagine how glorious their cities must be. What wonders those forests across the river must hold. "So you've never crossed the river?" Voice asked. "No man ever has, and no man is ever likely to. The moment a man touches that far shore, he will fall dead. The thread by which the fate of man hangs is a thin one indeed." "How's that?" Ezra Hayden only smiled. "Did you know that no human army ever won a battle against the elves before the arrival of Navran? At that time elves were our demons. The great library of Persepolis had realms. On it once we even thought they were gods. Their lifespan is so long that no one noticed them aging. Their death rites are so secret no human has ever seen an elven corpse. They were the firstborn, the children of Firil, great and powerful. In combat they were feared above all things. Sickness could be treated, bears and wolves could be hunted and trapped, storms and droughts prepared for. But nothing could stand before the elves. Their blades broke ours, their arrows pierced our armor, their shields were impenetrable, and of course they knew the art. Imagine a sky darkened with a host of Galactic, and they are only one of their weapons. Even without all that, without the art, their speed, eyesight, hearing, balance, and ancient skills are all beyond of the abilities of man. If that's true, how come they're over there and we're sitting here? It is all because of Navran. He showed us their weaknesses. He taught mankind how to fight, how to defend, and he taught us the art of magic. Without it, we were naked and helpless against them. I still don't see how we one voice challenged. Even with that knowledge, they still seem to have the advantage. True, and in an even fight we would have lost, but it wasn't even. You see, elves live for a very long time. I don't think any human actually knows how long, but they live for many centuries. At least there may be elves right now watching us that remember what Navran looked like, but no people can live that long and reproduce quickly. Elves have few children, and a birth for them is quite significant. Birth and death in the elven world are rare and holy things. Imagine the devastation and misery it must have been for them during the wars. No matter how many battles they won against us, each time their numbers were fewer than before. While we humans recovered our losses in a generation, it would take a millennium for elves. They were consumed, drowned, if you will, in a flooding sea of humanity. Ezra Hadden paused, then added, only now Navran is gone, there will be no savior this time. What do you think keeps them over there? These are their lands. To us it seems eons ago, but to them it is just yesterday. When they walked this side of the river, by now there are numbers of likely recovered. What keeps them on that side of the river? Then what keeps anyone from what they want? Fear of annihilation, fear that we would destroy them utterly. But Navran is dead. You mentioned that. Royce pointed at. I told you before that mankind has squandered the legacy of Navran, and it has done so at its own peril. Navran brought magic to man, but Navran is gone, and the magic forgotten. We sit here like children, naked and unarmed. Mankind is inviting the wrath of a race so far beyond us they won't even hear our cries. The elves' ignorance of our weakness sent this fragile agreement between the Aravan Empire and a dead emperor is all that remains of humanity's defense. It's a good thing they don't know. Then that's just it, the wizard told him. They are learning the Galara. Prince Ezra Hayden nodded. According to Navran's decree, the banks of the river Ned Walden Orion Contiter off limits to everyone. Royce roughly translated, garnering a faint smile from the wizard. I can read and write to a truly educated man. So as I was saying, the banks of the river Ned Walden Orion Contita. A look of realization washed over the thief's face. Dolgren is in violation of the treaty. Exactly. The decree also stipulates that elves are forbidden to take human lives, except should they cross the river. It says nothing about humans killed through benign actions. If I release a boulder, it could roll anywhere, but odds are it will roll downhill. If houses and people are downhill, it may destroy them. But it isn't me that's killing them, it's the boulder, and the unfortunate fact they live downhill from it, and they're watching what we do, how we deal with it. They're sizing up our strengths and weaknesses, much like you're doing with me. Ezra Harden smiled. Perhaps he said there's no way to be certain if they're responsible for the beast's presence. But one thing is certain, they are watching. When they see we are helpless against one Galara Bryn, if they feel the treaty is broken, or when it runs out, fear will no longer be a deterrent. Is that why you're really here? No, the wizard shook his head. It plays a part, but the war between the elves and man will come despite any action I can take. I am merely trying to lessen the blow and give humanity a fighting chance. It might begin by teaching some others to do what you did last night. The wizard looked at the thief. What do you mean? Koi doesn't suit you, boys told him. No, I suppose not. I thought you couldn't do your art without your hands. It's very hard and takes a great deal of time, and it isn't very accurate. Imagine trying to write your name with your toes. I began working on that spell before you arrived here, thinking it would come in handy at some point, as it was the flame wall nearly consumed you too. It was supposed to be several yards farther away and last for hours instead of minutes with hands. I could have trailed off. No sense going there, I suppose. Were you really that powerful? Before Ezra showed him a wicked smile. Oh my dear boy, you couldn't begin to imagine. Word of Thris's recovery quickly spread through the village. She was still a little groggy, but remarkably sound. She could see clearly. All her teeth were in her head, and she had an appetite. By mid-morning she was sitting up eating soup that day. There was a decidedly different look in the village's eyes. The unspoken thought in every mind was the same. The beast had attacked, and no one had died. Most had seen the winged beast outlined in the brilliant green flames that night. Alongside each of them that morning walked a strange companion, a long-lost friend who had returned unexpectedly. Hoped they got busy at dawn, preparing more wood fires. They had a system down now, and were able to build up the piles with just a few hours' work. Suspecting that the beast, obviously able to see well in the dark, might not be able to see through thick smoke, Vince Griffin suggested they use smudge pots. For centuries, farmers had used smudge pots to drive off insects that threatened to devour their crops, and Dahlgren was no different. Old parts were promptly gathered and filled as if a cloud of locust was on its way. At the same time, Adrian Todd Botherwick and Klein Goodman began surveying the outbuildings of the Lower Bailey for the best shelters. Adrian busied himself organizing small groups of men. One group started to expand the cellar they had found in the smokehouse, and another went to work digging a tunnel with the idea of trying to capture the beast. A huge serpent chasing a man might follow him into a tunnel, but if the tunnel gradually narrowed, they might be able to seal the exits before it realized its mistake. No weapon made by man might be able to slay it, but Hadrian guessed there were no restrictions on imprisoning the beast. Deacon Thomas was far from delighted with all the digging, cutting, and burning inside the castle grounds, but already it was clear that the villagers had found a new leader in Hadrian. Thomas remained quietly indoors caring for Thrace. Adrian, he was washing at the well in the village where he could find some privacy when he looked up to see Theron been doing some digging. I see the farmer said. Dylan mentioned you had them making a tunnel. Pretty smart thinking. The odds of it working are slim, patron explained, dicing his face with handfuls of water. But at least it's a shot. Listen, the farmer began with a pained look on his face, and then said nothing. Price is doing well? Adrian asked after a minute or so. She's great, as solid as her old man, he said proudly, thumping his own chest. It'll take more than a tree to break her. That's the thing about us woods. We might not look like it, but we're a strong lot. It might take us a while, but we come back, and when we do, we're stronger than ever. Thing is, we need something, a reason. I didn't have one, at least I didn't think I did. Thrace showed me different. They stood facing each other. An awkward silence. Listen, Varen said again, and once more paused. I'm not used to being beholden to anyone. You see, I've always paid my own way. I got what I have, my work, and lots of it. I don't ask anyone's help, and I don't apologize for the way I am. See, Pedro nodded. But well, a lot of what you said yesterday was true, only today some things are different. You follow Thras and me. We're gonna be leaving this place as soon as she's able. I'm figuring a couple of days rest and she be okay to travel. We'll head south, maybe to Oliver or even Calais, but here it stays warm longer. They're better growing season anyway. That still leaves us a few nights. We'll be here a few more nights. We'll have to live under this shadow. I'm not gonna lose my little girl the way I lost the others. Now I know an old farmer like me ain't much good to her, swinging a scythe or pitchfork against that thing. But if it comes to that, it would be good if I knew how to fight proper that way. If it comes, call on. Before we leave, at least there will be a chance. Now I haven't got much, but I do have some silver set aside, and I was wondering if your offer to teach me how to fight was still good. First we need to get something straight. Pedrian told him. Stanley, your daughter already paid us in full to do whatever we could to help you, so you keep your silver for the trip south, or I won't teach you a thing. Agreed. Theron hesitated, then nodded. Good. Well, I suppose we can begin right now if you're ready. Should we get your swords? Fair and asked. That would be a problem, considering I put my swords on Millie last night, and no one has seen her since, but that shouldn't matter for now. Should I cut Sticks, then the farmer asked. No, what then? How about sitting down and just listening? There's a lot to learn before you're ready to swing at anything. Theron looked at Hadron skeptically. You want me to teach you, right? If I said I wanted you to teach me to be a great farmer in a few hours, what would you say? Theron nodded in submission and sat down on the dirt not far from where Hadron had first met Pearl. Hadron slipped his shirt on, took a bucket, turned it over, and sat down in front of him. As with everything fighting takes practice, anything can look easy if you're watching someone who's mastered whatever it is they're doing. But what you don't see is the hours and years of effort that go into perfecting the craft. I'm sure you can plow a field in a fraction of the time it would take me for this very reason. Sword fighting's no different. Practice will allow you to react without thought to events, and even to anticipate those events. It becomes a form of foresight, the ability to look into the future and know exactly what your opponent will do even before he does. Without practice, you'll need to think too much when fighting a more skilled opponent. Even a split second of hesitation can get you killed. My opponent is a giant snake with wings, Theron said, and it has killed more than a score of men. Most certainly a more skilled opponent, wouldn't you say so? Practice is paramount. The question is, what do you need to practice? Swinging a sword, I should think. True, but that's only a small part of it. If it were merely swinging a sword, everyone with 2 legs and at least 1 arm would be experts. No, there's much more to it. First, there is concentration. That means more than just paying attention to the fight. It means not worrying about phrase or thinking about your family, the past, or the future. It means focusing on what you're doing beyond all else. Might sound easy, but it isn't. Next comes breathing. Breathing, Theron asked dubiously. Yeah, I know we breathe all the time, but sometimes we stop breathing or stop breathing correctly. Ever get startled and discover you are holding your breath? Ever find yourself panting when you're really nervous or frightened? Some people can actually pass out that way. Trust me, in a real fight you'll be scared, and unless you train, you'll end up breathing shallow or not at all. Less air saps your body of strength and makes it hard to think clearly. You'll become tired and slow, something you can't afford in a battle. So how do you breathe correctly? Fair enough. Still with a hint of sarcasm, you have to breathe deep and slow even before you need to, before your exertion demands it. At first it could be a conscious thought, and it will feel counterproductive, even distracting. But over time, it'll become a second nature. It's also good to keep in mind that you have the most strength for a blow. On an exhale, it adds power and focus to a stroke. Sometimes actually yelling or shouting helps. I want you to do that during your training. I want to hear it when you swing later on. It won't be necessary, although sometimes it can help to startle your opponent. Adrian paused briefly, and Theron noted a faint hint of a smile target his lips. Next comes balance, and that means more than not falling down. Sadly, humans only have 2 feet. That's only 2 points to support us. Pick up one and you're vulnerable. This is why you want to keep your feet on the ground. That doesn't mean you don't move, but when you move, you slide your feet rather than pick them up. You need to keep your weight forward, your knees slightly bent, and your balance on the balls of your feet rather than in your heels. Drawing your feet together reduces your 2 points of balance to 1, so keep your feet apart about shoulder width. Timing is of course very important. I warn you now, you'll be terrible at it to begin. With as timing improves with experience, you saw from swinging at me yesterday how frustrating it can be to swing and miss. Timing is what allows you to hit, and not only to hit, but also to do damage. You learn to see patterns and movement. You know when to expect an opening or a weakness. Frequently, you can anticipate an attack by watching how your opponent moves, the placement of his feet, the look in his eyes, the telltale drop of his shoulder, the tightening of a muscle. But I'm not a fighting person, Theron interrupted. I know you don't even think it has a shoulder. Even animals give signs about what they'll do. They hunch up, twist, and shift their weight just like people. Such signals don't have to be obvious. Most skilled fighters will try to mask their intentions, or worse, purposely try to mislead you. They want to confuse your timing, throw you off balance, and make an opening for themselves. Of course, this is exactly what you want to do to them if done well. Your opponent sees the false move, but not the attack. The result in your case is a headless flying serpent. The last thing to learn is the hardest. It can't be taught, it can barely be explained. It's the idea that the battle, doesn't really exist so much in your hands or your feet, but in your head. The real struggle is in your own mind. You must know you're going to win. Before you start to fight, you have to see it, smell it, and believe it utterly. It's a form of confidence, but you must guard against overconfidence. You have to be flexible, able to adapt in an instant, and never allow yourself to give up. Without this, nothing else is possible unless you believe you win. Fear and hesitation will hold you down while your opponent kills you. Now let's get a couple of stamp sticks, and we'll see how well you listened. That night they lit bonfires once more, and everyone stayed sheltered in either the manor house or the cellar of the smokehouse. Royce and Hadron were the only two moving outside, and even they remained in the shelter of the smokehouse doorway, watching the night by bonfire light. "How's Thrace doing?" Royce asked, his eyes on the sky. "Great, considering the fact that she broke a tree branch with her head," Adrian replied. "As you sat in a barrel cleaning a mutton bone of the last of its meat. I've even heard she was walking around asking to help with dinner." He shook his head and smiled. "That girl, she's something that's for sure. Hard to imagine it, seeing her under that arch in Kulnora. But she's tough." The real change is in the old man. Darren says they plan on leaving in a day or two, as soon as Thrace can travel, so we're out of a job. Royce, faint disappointment. "Why were you getting close?" Adrian asked, throwing the bone away and wiping his hands on his vest. "Nope, I can't figure out how to reach it." Tunnel, thought of that. But I've been over every inch of the forest and the rocks, and there's nothing, no cave, no sunken dell, nothing that could be confused with a tunnel. I'm completely stumped on this. What about Ezra? Doesn't the wizard have any ideas? Maybe, but he's being elusive. He's hiding something. He wants access to that tower, but won't say why, and avoids direct questions about it. Something happened to him here years ago, something he doesn't want to talk about, but maybe I can get him to open up tomorrow if I let him know the woods no longer require our services, and that there's no reason for me to try anymore. Don't you think you'll see through that?" "See through what?" Royce asked honestly. "I'm giving it one more try tomorrow. And if I can't find something, I say we head out with Theron and Thrace." Adrian was silent. What was asked? "I just hate to run out on them like that. I mean, they're starting to turn it around. You do this all the time. You get these lost causes under your skin. I'd like to remind you, coming here was your idea. I was in the process of declining the job, remember well. A lot can happen in a day. Maybe I'll find a way in tomorrow." Hadrian stepped to the doorway and peered out. "Forest is loud. Looks like our friend isn't coming to visit us tonight. Maybe Ezra Hardin's flames singed its wings, and it's dining on venison this evening. The fires won't keep it away forever," Royce said. "According to the wizard, the fires didn't hurt it, they just confused it. Bright lights do that, apparently. Only the sword in the tower can actually harm it. It'll be back, then we'd best take advantage of its absence and get a good night's sleep." Adrian went down into the cellar, leaving Royce staring out of the night sky and the gathering clouds that crossed the stars. The wind was still up, whipping the trees and battering the fires. He could almost smell a change was in the air, and it was blowing their way. Chapter 8, Myths and Legends. Royce stood on the bank of the river in the early morning light, trying to skip stones out toward the tower. None of them made more than a single jump before the turbulent water consumed them. His most recent idea for reaching the tower centered on building a small boat and launching himself upriver in the hopes of landing on the rocky parapet before the massive current washed him over the falls. Although there was no clear landing ground for such an attempt, it might be possible if he caught the current just right and landed against the rock. The force of the water would likely smash the boat or drive it under when it met the wall, but he might be able to scramble onto the precipice before going over. The problem was, even if he managed to perform this harrowing feat, there was no way back. He turned to see the wizard walking up the river trail, perhaps to keep an eye on him, but more likely to be on hand should he discover the entrance. Morning, the wizard said. "Any epiphanies today?" "Just one. There's no way to reach that tower." Ezra hard and looked disappointed. I've exhausted all the possibilities I can think of besides Varen and Thrace are going to be leaving Dargran. I no longer have a reason to bang my head against this tower. I see Ezra Hardin said, staring down at him. What about the welfare of the village? Are they my problem? This village shouldn't even be here. Remember, it's a violation of the treaty. It'll be best if all these people left, if we allowed to be. Wiped out, it could be seen as a sign of weakness and invite the elves to invade, and allowing the village to survive is breaking the treaty, resulting in the same possibility. Fortunately for me, I'm not wearing a crown. I'm not the emperor or a king, so it's not something I need to deal with. You're just going to leave. Is there a reason for me to stay? The wizard raised an eyebrow and looked long at the thief. What do you want? He asked at length. Are you proposing to pay me now? We both know I have no money, but still you want something from me. What is it? The truth? Were you after what happened here 900 years ago? The wizard studied Royce for a moment and looked down at his feet. After a few minutes, he nodded. He walked over to a beech lark that lay along the granite rock and sat down. He looked out toward the water and the spray as if searching for something in the mist, something that wasn't there. I was the youngest member of the Senjars. We were the Council of Wizards that worked directly for the Emperor, the greatest wizards the world had ever seen. There was also the test laws, comprised of the greatest of the Emperor's knights. Tradition dictated that a mentor from each council was to serve as teacher and full-time protector to the Emperor's son and heir. Because I was the youngest, it fell to me to be Nevrick's Senjar instructor, while Garish Growland was picked from the Teshla's Garish, and I didn't get along like most of the Teshlaws. He held a distrust of wizards, and I thought little of him and his British violent ways. Naverick, however, brought us together like his father, the Emperor Narion. Naverick was a breed apart, and it was an honor to teach him Garish, and I spent nearly all our time with Naverick. I taught him law books and the art, while Garish instructed him in the schools of combat and warfare, though I still felt the practice of physical combat was beneath the Emperor and his son. It was very clear that Garish was as devoted to Naverick as I was. In that middle ground, we found a foothold where we could stand together. When the Emperor decided to break tradition and travel here to Avempathia with his son, we went along. Break tradition? It had been centuries since an emperor had spoken directly to the elves after the war. There wasn't tribute paid or anything like that. No, all contact was severed at the Ned Walden. It was a very exciting time. No one really knew what to expect. I personally knew very little about Arvin Parker, beyond the historical account of how it was the site of the last battle of the Great Elven Wars. The Emperor met with several top officials of the Aravan Empire in the tower, while Garish and I attempted, without much luck, to continue Naverick's studies. The sight of the waterfall and the elven architecture was too much to compete with for the attention of a 12-year-old boy. It was around dusk, nearly night. Naverick had been pointing things out to us all day, reveling in the fact that neither Jewish nor I could identify any of the elven things he found. For example, there were several sets of elven clothes made of a shimmering material that we couldn't name, drying in the sun. This was, of course, the first time in centuries that humans had met with elves, placing us at a distinct disadvantage. Neverick delighted in stomping his teachers, so when he asked about the thing he saw flying towards the tower, I thought he saw a bird or a bat, but he said it was too large and that it looked like a serpent. He mentioned it had flown into one of the high windows of the tower. Now Rick was so adamant about it that we all went back inside. We had just started up the main staircase when we heard the screams. It sounded like a war was being fought above us. The personal bodyguards of the Emperor, a detachment of Tashlaws, were fighting off the Galara brand, protecting the Emperor as they fled down the stairs. I saw groups of elves throwing themselves at the creature, dying to protect our Emperor. The elves were Ezrahad and nodded. I was amazed by the sight. The whole scene is still so vivid to me, even after nearly 1,000 years. Still nothing the knights or the elves could do stop the attacking beast, which seemed determined to kill the Emperor. It was a terrible battle, with knights falling on the stairs and dying upon the wet steps. Elves joining them, the Emperor ordered us to get Naverick to safety. Cherish grabbed the boy and dragged him out of the tower, kicking and screaming. But I hesitated. I realized that once outside, the flying beast would be able to swoop down and kill at will. The art could not defeat it. The creature was magic, and without the key to unlock the spell, nothing I could do would alter that enchantment. A thought came to me, and as the Emperor exited the door, I cast an enchantment of binding. Not on the beast, but on the tower, trapping the Galara Bryn inside. Those knights and elves still inside died, but the beast was trapped. Where did it come from? What caused the thing to attack? Ezra Hardin shrugged. The elves insisted they knew nothing of the attack, and that they had no idea where the Galarbrand came from, except that one Galarbrand had been left unaccounted for. After the wars, they assumed it destroyed. They mentioned a militant society, a growing movement of elves within the Aravan Empire that sought to incite a war. It was speculated they were responsible. The elven lords apologized and assured us they would investigate the matter fully. The Emperor, convinced that to retaliate or even make the incident public was unwise, chose to ignore the attack and return home. So what's this about a weapon? The Galarabran is a conjured creature, a powerful magic endowed with a life of its own, beyond of the existence of its creator. The creature is not truly alive. It cannot reproduce, grow old, or appreciate existence. But it also cannot die. It can, however, be dispelled. No enchantment is perfect. Every magic has a seam where the weave can be unraveled. In the case of the Galara Bryn, the seam is its name. Whenever a Galara Bryn is created, so is an object, a sword etched with its name. It's used to control the beast, and if necessary, destroy it. According to the elves, at the end of the war, they placed all the Guilarbran swords in the tower per Navrin's orders. At that time, all the swords were accounted for, and all but one was notched to show their associated beast was destroyed. Royce got up to stretch his legs. Okay, so the Oven Lords held one of their monsters back just in case, or this militant group hid one to cause trouble. The Oven leaders tell you all the swords are in there. Maybe they are, or maybe they aren't, and they just want it's in there. Ezra Hardin interrupted. You saw it. We were given a tour when we first arrived. Near the top is a sort of memorial to the war. All the swords are on display. All right, so there is a sword, Roy said. But that's not why you want in. You didn't come here to save Daldarin. Why are you really here? You didn't allow me to finish, Ezra Hardin replied, sounding every bit like the wise teacher letting a student know to be patient. The Emperor believed he had prevented a war with the elves and returned home. But what waited for him was an execution. While we were away, the church, under the leadership of Patriarch Venlin, planned the Emperor's assassination. The attack came on the steps of the palace during a celebration commemorating the anniversary of the Empire's founding. Cherish and I escaped with Navarik. I knew that many of the Senjars and the Teshlaws were involved in the church's plot, and that they would find us. So Cherish and I came up with a plan. We hid Navarik, and I created two talismans. One I gave to Navrik, and the other to Cherish. These amulets would hide them from the clairvoyant search the Senjars were certain to make. But allow me to find them. Then I sent them away, and you, Bryce asked. I stayed behind. I tried to save the Emperor. He paused, looking far away. I failed. So what happened to the heir? Royce asked. How should I know? I was locked up in a prison for 900 years. Do you think he wrote me? Jairus was supposed to take him into hiding. The wizard allowed himself a grim smile. We both thought it would only be for a month or so. So you don't even know if an heir exists anymore? I'm pretty confident the church didn't kill him, or they would have killed me shortly thereafter. But what became of Cherish and Navrik? I don't know if anyone could have kept Navrik alive. It would have been Cherish. Despite his age, he was one of the best knights the Emperor had. The fact that he trusted his son to his care was a testament to that. Like all Tesla knights, Garish was a master of all the schools of combat. There wouldn't have been a man alive who could beat him in battle, and he would have died before surrendering Maverick. They would both be dead now. Of course, time would have seen to that. So would their great-great-grandchildren. If they had any, I suspect Garish would have known the need to perpetuate the line, and would have settled down somewhere quiet, and encouraged Navrik to marry, and have children, and wait for you. What's That was the plan, wasn't it? They run and hide, and you stay behind and find them when it's safe, something like that. So you had a way to contact them, a way to locate the heir, something to do with the amulets. 900 years ago, I would have said yes. But finding their descendants now is probably a fool's dream. Time can destroy so many things, but you're trying nevertheless. What else is there for an old crippled outlaw to do? Care to tell me how you plan to find them? I can't do that. I've already told you more than I should have. The air has enemies, and as fond as I have grown of you, that kind of secret stays with me. I owe that much to Cherish and Navrik, but something in that tower is part of it. That's why you want to get inside. Royce thought a moment. You sealed that tower just before you went to prison, and since the Galara Bren was only recently released, you can be almost certain that the interior of that tower hasn't been touched in all that time. It's the only place that's still the same as the day you left it. There's something in there you saw that day, something you left there, something you need to find. The air, it's a shame you aren't as good at deciphering a way to get into that tower. About that, Royce said you mentioned that the Emperor met with the elves in the tower. They aren't allowed on this bank, right? Correct. And there was no bridge on their side of the river, right? Again, correct. But you never saw how they entered the tower. No. Royce thought a moment, then asked, why were the stairs wet? Ezrahadin looked at him puzzled. What's that? You said earlier that when the knights were fighting off the Galarabran, they died on the wet steps. Was it blood? No, water. I think I remember how the stairs were wet when we were climbing up, because it made the stone so slippery I nearly fell. Some of the knights did fall. That's why I remember it. And you said the elves had clothes drying in the sun. Ezrahadin shook his head. I see where you're going with this. But not even an elf can swim to the tower. That may be true. But then why were they wet? Was it a hot day? Could they have been swimming? Ezrahadin raised his eyebrows incredulously. In that river? No, it was early spring and still cold. Then how'd they get wet? Royce heard a faint sound behind him. He started to turn, but stopped himself. We're not alone, he whispered. When you lunge, step in with the leg on your weapon side. It will give you more reach and better balance. Agent told Farron. The two were at the well again. They'd gotten up early, and Hadrian was putting Theron through some basic moves using two makeshift swords they'd created out of rake handles. To his surprise, Theron was sprier than he looked, and despite his size, the old man moved well. Hadron had gone over the basics of parries, ripostes, flèches, presses, and the lunge, and they were now working on a compound attack comprising a feint, a parry, and a riposte. Cuts and thrusts must follow one upon the other, without pause. The emphasis is always on speed, aggression, and deception, and everything is kept as simple as possible, Hadron explained. I listened to him. If anyone knows stick fighting, it's Hadrian. And Theron turned to see two equestrians riding into the village clearing, each leading a pack pony laden with poles and bundles. They were young men, not much older than Thrace, but dressed like young princes in handsome doublets and hose complete with box-pleated frill and lace edging. Marvin, Fan, and Adrian said astonished. Don't look so surprised. Marvin gave his horse rein to graze on the commons grass. Well, that's a little hard at this point. What in Mariber's name are you doing here? Just then a procession of musicians, heralds, knights, wagons, and carriages emerged from the dance forest. Long banners of red and gold streamed in the morning light. The standard bearers preceded the march, followed by the plumed imperial guards of the Nephron Church. Adrian and Theron moved aside against the trees for safety as the grand parade of elegantly draped stallions and gold-etched white carriages rolled in. They were well-dressed clergy and chain-mailed soldiers, knights with their squires leading pack horses laden with fine sets of shining metal armor. There were nobility with standards from as far away as Calais and Trent, but also commoners, rough men with broadswords and scarred faces, monks and tattered robes, and woodsmen with long bows and green hoods. Such an assortment of diverse characters made Hedgen think of a circus he had once seen, although this column of men and horses was far too grim and serious to be a carnival. Bringing up the rear echelon was a group of 6 riders in black and red with the symbol of a broken crown on their chest. At their head rode a tall, thin man with long black hair and a short trimmed beard. So they finally decided to do something about this. Patron said, I'm impressed the church would go to such an effort to save a little village so far out that even its own king doesn't care. But that still doesn't explain why you two are here. I'm hurt, Marvin. Fine, the chest pain granted. I'm over here to help Fanon, but I might try my hand as well. Although if you're going to be competing, it looks as if we shouldn't have bothered with the trip. Theron whispered to Hadrian, "Who are these people? And what is he talking about?" "Ah, sorry, this is Marvin and Fanon Pickering, sons of Count Pickering of Galilean and Melanger, who are apparently very lost." "Marvin Fanon, this is Theron Wood. He's a farmer, and he's paying you for lessons." "Smart idea. But how did you to get here ahead of the rest of us? I didn't see you at any of the camp, so what am I thinking you?" And Royce probably had no trouble discovering the location of the contest. Royce was probably hiding under the Archbishop's desk cause he set up the rules. "So will it be swords? If it's swords, Fano has a real chance to win. But if it's a joust, well," he glanced at his brother, who scowled, "he's really not that good. Do you know how the eliminations will work? I can't imagine they're pit noble against commoner, which means Fanon won't be competing with you, so you're not here to slay the Galara Bryn. Are you saying these people are here for that stupid contest?" "Killer a Bryn? What's a Galara Bryn? Is that like Oswald the Bear?" "Heard about him coming through Dunmore, terrorized villages for years, until the king killed him with just a dagger. The entourage traveled past them." With that pause up towards the manor house, one of the coaches separated from the group just after it cleared the well. It stopped, and a young, well-dressed woman exited and ran to them, holding the edge of her skirt up to avoid the dirt. "Adrian," she cried with a bright smile. Adrian bowed and Theron joined him. "Is this your father, Adrian?" she asked. "No, your highness. May I present Theron Wood of Dahlgren Village." "Theron, this is her royal highness, Princess Arista Melanger." Theron stared at Hadrian, shocked. "You really get around, don't you?" Adrian smiled awkwardly and shrugged. "Hey, Arista," Fano said. "Guess what Adrian says? The contest is a killer beast." "I didn't say that, which is just fine by me, because if Hadrian was going to be competing, I think I would have to withdraw, but now Hunt is a much different story. You know, luck is often a deciding factor in these things." Arista laughed at him. "Attended several beasts saying contest. Have you?" Fanon fine, and scoffed. "You know what I mean. Sometimes you're just in the right place at the right time." Marvin shrugged. "Doesn't sound like much of a contest for noblemen, really. If it turns out to be true, I'll be disappointed. Slaughtering a poor animal is no good use for a Pickering sword." "Say, did you also hear what the prize will be?" Fan and asked. "The way they've been selling this contest in every square church and tavern across Avon. It has to be big. Will it just be a gold trophy, or is it land? I'm hoping to get an estate out of this. Marvin will inherit our father's title, but I have to fend for myself. What does this animal look like? Is it a bear? Is it big? Have you seen it?" Pedrian and Theron exchanged stunned looks. "What is it?" Fanon asked. "It's not dead already." "No," Pedrian said. "It's not dead already, oh good, your highness." A woman's voice came from the carriage, still lingering up the trail. "We need to be going. The archbishop will be waiting." "I'm sorry, should tell them I have to go. It was good seeing you again." She waved and ran back to a waiting carriage. "We should probably be going to." Marvin said. "We want to get Fallon's name as near to the top of the list as we can." "Wait, Paige, and tell them don't enter the contest." What they both said. "We rode days to get here for this." Fanon complained. "Take my advice, turn around right now and head back home. Take a risk with you two and anyone else you can convince to go. If this is a competition to kill the Galara Bryn, don't sign up. You don't want to fight this thing. I'm serious, you don't know what you're dealing with. If you try and fight this creature, it will kill you. But you think you can kill it. I'm not fighting it. Royce and I were just here doing a job for Theron's daughter, and we were about to leave." Royce is here to Fan and asked, looking around. "Do your father a favor and leave now." Marvin frowned. "If you were anyone else, I would take your tone as insolent. I might even call you a coward and a liar, but I know you're neither." Marvin sighed and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Still, we did ride an awfully long way to just turn around. You say you were preparing to leave. When will that be?" Adrian looked at Theron. "Another 2 days, I think," the old farmer told Adrian. "I don't want to go until I know Thrice will be okay. Then we'll stay here for that long and see for ourselves what spot. If it turns out to be as you say, we leave with you. Is that fair?" "Fallon, I don't see why you can't go, and I stay after all. I'm the one who's going to enter the contest. No one is going to kill that thing." Famine Pedro and told him, "Listen, I've been here for 3 nights. I've seen it, and I know what it can do. It's not a matter of skill or courage. Your sword Won't harm it no one's will fighting that creature is nothing more than suicide. I'm not deciding yet fan and declared we aren't even certain what the contest is. I won't sign up right away. But I'm not leaving either, do me a favor. Then Pedro, and tell them at least stay indoors. Tonight something or someone was in the thickets. Royce left Ezra Hardin and moved away to the river's edge, careful not to look in the direction of the sound. He descended from the rocks to the depression near the river and slipped into the trees. Circling back, something was there, and it was working hard to be quiet. At first Royce caught a glimpse of orange and blue through the leaves and almost thought it was nothing more than a blue bird, but then it shifted. It was far too large to be a bird. Royce drew closer and saw a light brown braided beard, a broad flat nose, a blue leather vest, large black boots, and a bright orange shirt with puffed sleeves. Magnus Royce greeted the dwarf loudly, causing him to stumble and fall out of the bramble. He slipped backward off the little grassy ledge and fell on his back to the bare rock not far from where Ezra Hardin sat with the winds knocked out of him. The dwarf lay gasping for breath. Royce slept down and placed his dagger to the dwarf's throat. A lot of people have been looking for you, Royce told him menacingly. I have to admit I rather want to see you again myself, to thank you for all the help you gave me in Essendon Castle. Don't tell me this is the dwarf that killed King Umrith of Melanger. Ezra Hardin said his name is Magnus, or at least that's what Percy Braga called him. He's a master trap builder and stone carver, isn't that right? It's my business, the dwarf protested, still struggling for air. I'm a craftsman. I take jobs the same as you. You can't fault a guy for working. I almost died due to your work, Royce told him, and you killed the king. All Rick will be very pleased when I tell him I finally eliminated you. And as I recall, there's a price on your head. Wait, hang on, Magnus shouted. It was nothing personal. Can you tell me you never killed anyone for money? Royce hesitated. Yes, I know who you are. The dwarf told him. I wanted to find out who beat my trap. You used to work for the Black Diamond, and not as a delivery boy either. It was my job. I tell you, I don't care about politics or brag or Resondon. I suspect he's telling the truth. Ezra Hayden said, I've never known a dwarf to care at all for the affairs of humans, beyond the coin they can obtain. See, he knows what I'm saying. You can let me go. I said you were telling the truth, not that he should let you live. In fact, now that I can see you've been eavesdropping on our conversations, I have to encourage the notion of ending your life. I can't be sure how much you heard what the dwarf cried. After slitting his throat, you could just roll his little body off the ledge here. The wizard stepped up and looked over the cliff. No, Royce replied. It'll be better to toss him off the falls. He's not that heavy. His body will likely carry all the way to the Goblin Sea. Do you need his head? Ezra Hardin asked. To take back to Ulrich it would be nice, but I'm not carrying a severed head for a week while traveling through those woods. It would draw every fly for miles, and it would stink after a few hours. Trust me, I speak from experience. The dwarf looked at both of them in horror. No, he shouted in panic as Royce pressed his blade to his neck. I can help you. I can show you how to get to the tower. Royce looked at the wizard, who appeared skeptical. For the love of Jerome, I'm a dwarf. I know stone, I know rock, I know where the tunnel to the tower is. Royce relaxed as dagger. Let me live, and I'll show it to you. He turned his head toward Ezra Hardin. And as for what I've heard, I care nothing about the affairs of wizards and Manile. Never say a word. If you know dwarves well, then you know we're a lot like stone when we choose to be. So there is a tunnel, Royce said. Of course there is. Before I decide, Royce asked, what are you doing here? I was finishing another job, that's all. And what was this job? Building? Sinister. But just made a sword for a guy all the way out here. Who is this person? Lord Rufus. Somebody. I was hired to come here to make it. I was told he would meet me honest, no traps, no killings. And how are you still alive? How did you get out of Melanger? How is it you haven't been caught? My employer is very powerful, Miss Rufus. Guy, no, I'm making the sword for him. But Rufus isn't my employer. So who is? Royce heard footfall. Someone was running up the trail, thinking it might be the dwarf's associates. He slipped behind Magnus. He gripped his hair, pulled his head back, and prepared to slit his throat. Royce. Todd Botherwick shouted up to them from down near the water. What is it, Todd? He asked cautiously. How you doing? Sent me. He says you should come back to the village right away. but that Ezra should steer clear. Why, the wizard asked. Hadrian said to tell you that the church of Nephron just arrived. The church? Ezra Hardin muttered. Here. Is there a Lord Rufus with them? Royce asked. Could be. There's a whole lot of fancy folk around. Must be at least one lord in the bunch. Any idea why they're here? Tad. Nope. You might want to make yourself scarce. Royce told the wizard someone might have mentioned your name. I'll go see what's happening in the meantime. He looked down at the dwarf. It would appear your employer has just arrived. Your death sentence has been suspended. This kindly old man is going to watch you this afternoon, and you're going to stay right here. Then later you're going to show us where this tunnel is. And if you're telling the truth about knowing, then you live. Anything short of that, and you're going over the falls into pieces. Agreed. Good. He looked back at the wizard. Want me to tie him up? I just hit him over the head with a rock, Royce asked, panicking. The dwarf again. Won't be necessary. Magnus' hair looks like the honorable type. Besides, I can still manage a few surprisingly unpleasant things. Do you know what it's like to have live ants trapped inside your head? The dwarf didn't move or speak. Royce searched him. He found a belt under his clothes with little hammers and some rock shaping tools and a dagger. Royce looked at the dagger, surprised. I tried copying it, the dwarf told him nervously. It's not very good. I was working from memory. Royce compared it to his own dagger. The two were very similar in design, though the blades were clearly different. Moise's weapon was made of an almost translucent metal that shimmered in the light, while Magnus's dagger seemed dull and heavy by comparison. The thief threw the dagger over the cliff. That's a magnificent weapon you have, the dwarf told him, mesmerized by the blade that a moment before had been at his throat. It's a Tor blade, isn't it? Royce ignored him and spoke to Esarhaddon. Keep an eye on him. I'll be back later. Arista took a seat on the balcony above the entrance to the great hall of the manor house, along with the entourage of the archbishop, which included Sorley and Sentinel Louis Sky. It was a very small balcony, created of rough logs and thick ropes where only a few could fit, but Bernice managed to squeeze away in and remained standing just behind her. Bernice's hovering out of sight was as irritating as a mosquito in the dark. Arista had no idea what was going on. Few people appeared to when they had arrived. Everything was in chaos. The lord of the manor was apparently dead, and the place was filled with peasants. They were promptly chased out. Louis Guy and his Surrette established order and assigned quarters based on rank. She was given a cramped but private room on the second level. It was a ghastly place, lacking even a single window. A bare rug lay on the floor. The head of a moose locked down at her from above the bed, and a coat rack made from deer antlers hung from the wall. Bernice was busy unpacking her clothes from the trunk when Sully stopped by, insisting Arista join him on the balcony. At first she thought the contest might be starting, but it was common knowledge it would begin at nightfall. A trumpeter stepped up to the rail and blared a fanfare on his horn. Below in the courtyard, a crowd formed. Men rushed over, some holding drinks or half-eaten meals. One man trotted up, still buttoning his pants. The growing audience created a mass of heads and shoulders bunched together, all staring up at them. The archbishop slowly stood up, dressed in full regalia of long embroidered robes. He spread his arms in a grand gesture and spoke, his raspy voice barely adequate to the task. It is time to announce the details of this event and reveal the profound happening that you, the devoted of Navran, are about to take part in. When events old altered forever, several people in the back complained they couldn't hear, but the archbishop ignored them and went on. I know some of you came believing this contest was to be a battle of swords or lancers, like some Wintertide's tournament. Instead, what you will see is nothing less than a miracle. Some of you will die, one will succeed, and the rest will bear witness to the world. A terrible evil haunts this place here on the Mid-Walden River at the edge of the world. There's a beast, not a great bear like Oswald, that terrorized Glamrander. This creature is none other than the legendary Galara Bryn the Horror, not a monster so terrible that even in those days of heroes and gods, only Navran or one of his blood could slay it. It will be your task, your challenge, to slay the creature and save this poor village from the ancient curse. A mama broke out among those gathered, and the archbishop raised his hands to quiet them. Silence For I have not yet told you. He waited as the mob grew quiet, many pushing closer to hear. As I said, the Galactic is a beast that only Navran or one of his bloodline can slay. And as such, he that succeeds in vanquishing this terror, the heir to the imperial crown, the long-lost heir of Navran. The reaction was surprisingly quiet. There were no cheers, no shouts of jubilation. The crowd as a whole appeared stunned. They remained staring as if expecting more. The archbishop in turn looked around, equally bewildered by the hesitancy of the congregation. Did he just say the winner would be the heir? Arista asked, looking at Sorley, who appeared as if he just smelled something unpleasant. He smiled at her and, standing up, whispered in the archbishop's ear. The older man took his seat, and Bishop Sauter addressed the crowd. For centuries the church has struggled to find the true heir to restore the bloodline of our holy Lord Navran. The great Sali's voice was loud and warm and carried well on the pine-scented afternoon air. We have searched, but all we had to guide us were old books and rumors, speculation, really hopes and dreams. There has never been a means of finding him, no absolute method to determine where the heir was or who he may be. Many have falsely claimed to be his descendant. Many unworthy men have striven to take that lofty crown, and the church has sat helpless. Still we have faith he is out there. Navran would not allow his own blood to die. We know he lives. He may be oblivious to who he is. 1,000 years have passed since his disappearance, and who of us can accurately trace our lineage back to the days of the old empire? Who knows if one of us might have an ancestor who went to his grave with a terrible secret, a terrible wonderful secret. The Galactic is a miracle Navran has sent. It is a tool to show us his son. He has confided this to the patriarch and told his holiness that he should hold a contest, and if he did, the heir would be among his contestants. The truth of his lineage oblivious even to himself. So you see, you, any one of you may be the heir of Navran, possessor of divine blood. A god. Have any of you sensed a power within, a belief in your own worth beyond that of others? This is your chance to prove to all of Elan that you are no fool, no mere man. Place your name upon the roster. Ride out at nightfall, slay the beast, and you will become our divine ruler. You will not be a mere king, but emperor, and all kings will bow to you. You will take the imperial throne in Aquesta. All loyal imperialists and the full force of the church will support you as we usher in a new age of order that will bring peace and harmony to the land. All you need do is to what say oh this time. The crowds cheered. Sauter glanced briefly at the archbishop and stepped away from the balcony to take a seat. When Royce reached Dalgren, the village was in turmoil. People were everywhere. Most of the villagers were heading toward the common well. There were plenty of new faces, all of the men most carrying some sort of weapon. Royce found Hadrian mobbed by villagers at the well. None of them looked happy. Where do we go now? Sellenbrockton asked in tears. Hadrian once more stepped up on the well, standing over the crowd and looking like he wants to break something. I don't know, Mrs. Brockton. Home, I guess, for now at least. But our home as a thatched roof. Try digging cellars and getting as low as possible. What's going on? Bryce asked. The Archbishop of Ghent has arrived and moved into the manor house. He and his clergy, as well as a few dozen nobles, have taken over the castle and driven everyone else out, well, except for Russell Dillon and Klein, whom he ordered to fill in the shelter and the tunnel we were digging, saying they could repair the damages or hang for destruction of property. Good old Deacon Thomas. He stands there nodding and saying, I tell them not to do it, but they wouldn't listen. They kept most of the livestock to saying was in the castle, so it belonged to the manor. Now everyone blames me for losing their animals. What about the bonfires? Royce asked. We could still build one here in the commons. No good, Adrian told him. His lordship declared it unlawful to cut trees in the area and confiscated the oxen with the rest of the animals. Did you tell him what will happen when the sun goes down? I can't tell him anything. Adrian threw up his hands, running his fingers through his hair as if he might start pulling it out. I can't get past the 20-odd soldiers he has at the castle gate, which is a good thing too, or I might kill the guy. Why is the church here at all? That's the kicker, Adrian told him. You know that competition the church has been announcing. Turns out that contest is to slay the Galactic. What they intend to send contestants out to fight the thing at nightfall. And if they die, they'll send the next one. They've got a damn list nailed to the castle gate. It's all right. It's all right, Deacon Thomas shouted. Everyone turned to see the cleric coming down the trail from the castle, approaching the crowd at the well. He walked with his hands raised, as if in blessing. On his face he had a great smile, which turned his eyes into half moons. Everything is going to be fine, he told them in a loud, confident voice. The Archbishop has come to help us. They're going to kill the beast and save us from this nightmare. All about our livestock, Vince Griffin asked. They'll need most of them to feed the troops, but what isn't used will be returned after the beast has been slain. The crowd crumbled. Now, what price do you put on safety? What price do you put on the lives of your children, or a pig and a cow worth the lives of your children, your wife? Consider it a tithe and be thankful. The church has come to Dahlgren to save us. No one else has. The king of Dunmord ignored us, but your church has responded by sending not just some night on our grave, but the Archbishop of Ghent himself. Soon the beast will be dead and Dahlgren will be a place of happiness once more. If that means 1 year of no meat and plowing without an ox, surely that's not too high a price to pay now. Everyone, please back to your homes. Stay out of their way and let them do their work. What about my daughter? Theron growled and pushed forward, looking like he might kill the deacon. It's all right. I've spoken with the Archbishop and Bishop Salder, and they have agreed to let us stay. They've moved her to a smaller room, but they won't let me in to see her, the old farmer snapped. I know, Thomas said in a soothing voice, but I just came down to explain a few things. I'm heading right back, and I promise you I'll stay by her side and watch over her until she's well. Adrian slipped out of the crowd that now shifted around the deacon. He turned to Royce with a bitter look. Tell me you found a way into the tower. Roy shrugged. Maybe we need to check it out tonight. Adrian asked. Shouldn't such things be done on the daylight, when we can both see? The things with complicated names aren't flying around. Not if I'm right, and if you're wrong. If I'm wrong, we're both certainly die, most likely by being eaten. The thing is, I know you're not kidding. Did I mention I lost my weapons? With any luck we won't need them. What we will need, however, is a good length of rope, 60 feet at least. Royce told him. Lanterns, wax, a tinder box. I'm not going to like this, am I? Hadron asked miserably. Not at all, Royce replied. Chapter 9, Trials by Moonlight. Back in bed, the man shouted. Back in bed. This instant Arista was wandering the hallway of the manor house, as much to get to know her surroundings as to evade Bernice, who was insisting she take a nap. Initially she thought the yelling was directed at her, and while she put up with Bernice sent her pampering, she was certainly not about to allow anyone to address her in such a manner as this brassy fellow seemed to be doing. She was no longer in her native kingdom of Malanga, where she was princess of the realm, but she was still a princess and an ambassador, and no one had the right to speak to her like that. With a fury in her countenance, she marched forward and, turning a corner, spotted a middle-aged man and a young girl. The girl was dressed only in her nightgown, her face battered and bruised. He held her wrist, attempting to drag her into a bedroom. Unhand her, Arista ordered Hilfred. Guards. The man and girl both looked at her bewildered. Hilfred raced around the corner and in an instant stood with sword drawn between his princess and the source of her anger. I said, get your filthy hands off of this instant, or I'll have them removed at the wrist. But the man began from the other direction. To Imperial guards, arrived, my lady. The guards greeted her. Hilfred said nothing, but merely pointed his sword at the man's throat. Take this wretch into custody, Arista ordered. He's forcing himself on this girl. No, please, the girl protested. It was my fault. It is not your fault. Arista looked at her with pity. And you needn't be afraid. I can see to it that he never bothers you or anyone again. Oh dear Maribor, protect me, the man prayed. Oh no, you don't understand, the girl said. He wasn't hurting me, he was trying to help me. How's that? I had an accident. She pointed to the bruises on her face. Deacon Thomas was taking care of me, but I was feeling better today and wanted to get up and walk. But he thought it best if I stay in bed another day. He is really only trying to look out for me. Please don't hurt him. He's been so kind, you know. This man, Arista asked the guards. He was cleared for entrance by the Archbishop as the deacon of this village, my lady, and he was indeed attending to this girl, who was known as Thrace Thomas, with his eyes wide with fear. And Hilfred's sword steady at his throat nodded as best he could and attempted a friendly, though strained smile. "Well," Arista said, pursing her lips, "my mistake." Then she looked at the guards. "Go back about your business, princess." The guards bowed briskly, turned, and walked back the way they had come. Hilfred slowly sheathed his sword. She looked back at the two. "My apologies. It's just that well, never mind." She turned away, embarrassed. "Oh no, your highness," Thrace said, attempting as best she could to curtsy. "Thank you so much for coming to my aid, even if I didn't actually need it. It's so good to know that someone as great as you would bother to help a poor farmer's daughter." Thrace looked at her in awe. "I've never met a princess before. I've never even seen one. I hope I'm not too much of a disappointment." Then Thrace was about to speak again, but Arista beat her to it. "What happened to you?" She gestured at her face. Thrace reached up, running her fingers over her forehead. "Is it that bad?" "It was the Galactic, your highness," Thomas explained. Thrace and her father Theron were the only two to ever survive a Galactic attack. "Now please, my dear girl, please get back in bed." "But really, I am feeling much better. Let her walk with me a bit, Deacon," Arista said, softening her tone. "If she feels worse, I'll get her back to bed." Thomas nodded and bowed. Arista took Thrace by the arm and led her up the hallway, Hilfred walking a few steps behind. They could not travel far, only 30 yards or so. The manor house was not a real castle. It was built from great rough-cut beams, some with the box still on, and she guessed there were only about 8 bedrooms. In addition, there were a parlor and office, and the great hall with a high ceiling and mounted heads of deer and bears. It reminded Arista of a crude or smaller version of King Rosworth's residence. The floor was made of wide pine planks, and the outer walls were thick logs. Nailed along them were iron lanterns holding flickering candles that cast semicircles of quivering light. For even though it was mid-afternoon, the interior of the manor was dark as a cave. "You're so kind," the girl told her. "The others treat me as if I don't belong here." "Well, I'm glad you're here," Arista replied. "Other than my handmaid Bernice, I think you're the only other woman here. It's just that everyone else was sent back home, and I feel so out of place, like I'm doing something wrong." Diggin Thomas says, "I'm not." He says, "I'm hurt, and I need time to recover, and that he'll see to it no one bothers me. He's been very nice. I think he feels as helpless as everyone else around here, maybe taking care of me as a battle he feels he can win. I mischarged the Deacon," Arista told her. "And you are all farmers' daughters, and Dolgren so wise." "Why, he's..." Thrace looked embarrassed. Arista smiled at her. "Where's your family?" "My father is in the village. They won't let him in to see me, but the Deacon is working on that. I don't think it matters, as we'll be leaving Dalargren as soon as I can travel, which is another reason I want to get my strength back. I want to get away from here. I want us to find a new place and start fresh. I find a man, get married, have a son, and call him Hickory. Quite a plan. But how are you feeling really?" "I still have headaches, and to be honest, I'm getting a little dizzy right now. Maybe we should head back to your bedroom." Then Arista said, and they turned around. "But I am feeling so much better than I was. That's another reason why I got up. I haven't been able to thank Ezra. I thought he might be in the halls here somewhere." "Ezra?" Arista asked. "Is he the village doctor?" "Oh no, doctors never had a doctor." "Ezra is, well, he's a very smart man. If it hadn't been for him, both me and my father would be dead by now. He was the one who made the medicine that saved me. He sounds like a great person." "Oh, he is. I try to pay him back by helping a maid. He's very proud, you understand, and he would never ask, so I offer, and I can see he appreciates. Is he too poor to afford food?" "Oh no, he just doesn't have any hands." "Char is a myth." As Rahadin was saying to the dwarf, "Has Royce and Adrian arrived at the falls?" "Says you." Magnus replied the wizard, and the dwarf sat in the rocky escarpment facing each other, arguing over the roar. The sun, having dropped behind the trees, left the two in shadow, but the crystalline spires atop of Impartha caught the last rays of dying red light. Ezra Hardin sighed. "I never understand what it is about religion that causes otherwise sensible people to believe in fairy tales. Even in the world of religion, Tor is a parable, not a reality. You're dealing with myths based on legends, based on superstitions, and taking it literally. That is very unwarf-like. Are you certain you don't have some human blood in your ancestry? That's just insulting." Magnus glared at the wizard. "You deny it, but the proof is right, before you. If you had dwarven eyes, you could see the truth in that blade." Magnus gestured at Royce. "What's all this about?" Patron asked. "Hello, Magnus, murder anyone?" Lately, the dwarf scowled. "This dwarf insists that Royce's dagger was made by Kyle." Ezra Hardin explained. "I didn't say that." The dwarf snapped. "I said it was a Turb blade. It could have been made by anyone from Tur." What Stir Haddon asked. "A misguided cult of lunatics that worship a fictitious god. They named him Kyle. Of all things, you'd think they could have at least come up with a better name." "I've never heard of Kyle," Pedro said. "Now, I'm not a religious scholar, but I remember what a little monk once told me. The dwarfen god is Drone, the elfish god is Firil, and the human god is Maribor. Their sister, the goddess of flora and fauna, is Muriel, right? And her son Bubulin is the god of darkness. So how does this Kyle fit in? He's their father." Ezra Hardin explained. "Oh right, I forgot about him. But his name isn't Kyle, it's Erebus or something, isn't it? He raped his daughter and his sons killed him. But he's not really dead." It didn't make a lot of sense to me, Ezra Hardin chuckled. "Religion never does so." "Who is Kyle?" "Well, the cult of Tur, or Kyle, as it's also known, insists that a god is immortal and cannot die. This deranged group of people appeared during the imperial reign of Esteman II and began circulating the story that Erebus had been drunk, or whatever equivalent there is to a god, when he raped his daughter, and he was ashamed for what he did. The story goes that Erebus allowed his children, the gods, to believe they had killed him. Then he came to Muriel in secret and begged her forgiveness. She told her father that she wasn't ready to forgive him and would only do so after he did penance. She said he had to do good deeds throughout Iran, but as a commoner, not as a god or even a king. For each act of sacrifice and kindness she approved of, she would grant him a feather from her marvelous robe, and when her robe was gone, she would forgive and welcome him home. The Kyle legend says that ages ago, a stranger came to a poor village called Tur. No one knows where it was, of course, and over the centuries, its location has changed in response to various claims. But the most common legend places it in Delgos, because it was being regularly attacked by the Darker, and of course, because of the similarities and names to the port city of Tur Del Fur. The story goes that the stranger called himself Kyle, and entering into Tur and seeing the terrible plight of the desperate villagers, taught them the art of weapon making to help in their defense. The weapons he taught them to make were reputed to be the greatest in the world, capable of cleaving through solid iron as if it were soft wood. Their shields and armor were light and get stronger than stone. Once he taught them the craft, they used it to defend their homes. After driving off, the Darker legend says there was a thunderclap on a cloudless day, and from the heavens a single white feather fell into Kyle's hands. He wept at the gift and bid them all farewell, never to be seen again, at least not by the residents of Tur. Throughout the various reigns of different emperors, there always seemed to be at least one or two stories of Kyle appearing here, and they're doing good deeds and obtaining his feather. The legend stood out beyond all others because the poor village of Tur was now famous for its great weaponry. I've never heard of a town by that name. You aren't the only one, Israel Hardin said. So the myth experts added a page to their story, as so often happens with these ridiculous tales. When they crash into the face of reality, supposedly the village was inundated with requests for arms. The tourists didn't feel it was right to make weapons for just anyone, so they only made a few, and only for those who had a just and good need. Powerful kings, however, decided to take the God-given craft secrets for themselves and prepare to battle for control of the village. On the day of the battle, however, the armies marched in to discover that the village of Tur, all its inhabitants and buildings, was gone. Not a trace was left of their existence, except for a single white feather that came from no known bird. Convenient, Patron said. Exactly, the wizard replied. One mystery covered by another, but never any real evidence. Still, it doesn't stop people from believing. For your information, Magnus spoke up, Tur Del Fur was once a dwarven city, and in my tongue its name means village of Tur. There are legends among my people of it once having been the source of great craftsmen who knew the secrets of folding metal and making great swords. Any dwarf in a land would give his beard for the secrets of Tur, or even the chance to study a Tur blade. And you think all the stone is a Tur blade? Hadron asked. What did you call it? Magnus asked, his beady eyes abruptly focusing on him. Other stone. That's what Royce calls his dagger. Hadron explained, "Don't encourage him." Roy said, his eyes fixed on the tower. "Where did he get this alva stone?" the dwarf asked, lowering his voice. "It was a gift from a friend," Hagen said. Ryan, "Oh, and where did the friends get it from?" the dwarf persisted. "You are aware I can hear you," Royce told them. Then, seeing something, he pointed toward Arvin Parker. Their look, they all scrambled up to peer at the outline of the fading tower. The sun was down now, and tonight was upon them like great mirrors. The river and the tower captured the starlight, and the luminous moon. The mist from the falls appeared as eerie white fog skirting the base. Near the top of the spires, a dark shape spread its wings and flew down along the course of the river. It wheeled and circled back over the falls, catching air currents and rising higher, until with a flap of its massive wings the beast headed out over the trees above the forest, flying toward Dahlgren. "That's its lair," Hadrian asked incredulously. "It lives in the tower." "Convenient, isn't it?" Worse remarked that the beast resides at the same place as the one weapon that can kill it. "Convenient for whom? I guess that remains to be seen." Ezra Hardin said. Royce turned to the dwarf. "All right, my little mason. Shall we head to the tunnel?" "It's in the river, isn't it? Somewhere underwater." Magnus looked at him surprised. "I'm only guessing, but from the look on your face I must be right. It's the only place I haven't look. Now, in return for your life, you will show us exactly where Arista stood with the Pickerings on the south stockade wall." Watching the sunset over the gate, the wall provided the best view of both the courtyard and the hillside beyond, while keeping them above the turmoil below. Knights busy themselves dressing in armor, archers strung their bows, horses decorated in comparisons shifted on Isley, and priests prayed to Navrin for wisdom. The contest was about to commence. Beyond the wall, the village of Dahlgren remained silent. Not a candle was visible. Nothing moved. Another scuffle broke out near the gate, with a list of combatants hung on the hitching post. Arista could see several men pushing and swinging, rising dust. "Who is it this time?" Marvin asked. The elder Pickering leaned back against the log wall. He wasn't a simple loose tunic and a pair of soft shoes that day. This was the Marvin she most remembered, the carefree boy who had challenged her to stick duels back when she stood a foot taller, and could overpower him in the days when she had a mother and father. And her greatest challenge was making Linaire jealous. "I can't tell," Fallon replied, peering down. "I think one is Sir Erlich." "Why are they fighting?" Arista asked. "Everyone wants a higher place on the list," Marvin replied. "That doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter who goes first." "It does if the person in front of you kills the beast before you get a chance. But they can't. Only the air can kill the beast." "You really think that?" Marvin asked, turning around, grasping the sharpened points of the logs and paring down the outside of the wall. "No one else does." "Who's first on the list?" "Well, Tobias Reckner was." "Which one is he?" she asked. "He's the one we told you about, with a big mysterious wagon." Their Fannin pointed down in the courtyard, the foppish-looking one leaning against the smokehouse. "He has a shrill voice and a superior attitude that makes you want to throttle him." Morthen nodded. "That's him." I peeked under his top. "There's this huge contraption made of wood, ropes and pulleys." He managed to find the list first and sign his name. No one had a problem with it when they thought the contest was a tournament. Everyone was just itching to have a go at him. But now, well, the thought of Tobias's emperor has become a communal fear. "What do you mean?" "Was he got bumped?" Fallon said. "Bumped? Louis Sky's idea," Marvin explained. "The Sentinel decreed that those farther down on the list could move up via combat. Those unsatisfied with their place could challenge anyone for their position to a fight. Once issued, the challenged party could trade positions on the list or enter into combat with the challenger. Surrendon of Chadwick challenged Tobias, who gave up his position. Who could blame him? Only Sir Graven had the courage to challenge Endon, but several others drew swords against one another for lesser spots. Most expected the duels would be by points, but Guy declared battles over only who the opponent yielded. So if gone on for hours, many have been injured. So Graven yielded only after End and pierced his shoulder. He's announced he's withdrawing and will be leaving tomorrow. And he's not the only one. Several have already left wrapped in bandages. Arista looked at Fannin. "You aren't challenging?" Marvin chuckled. "It was kind of funny the moment Guy made the announcement. Everyone looked at us. But you didn't challenge." Fannin scowled and glared at Marvin. "He won't let me." and my name is near the bottom. Agent Blackwater told us not to sign up," Marvin explained. So Marvin stared at his brother. So the one man here who could take that top spot without breaking a sweat doesn't even have his name on the list. Either he knows something we don't, or he thinks he does. That's worth waiting out the first night at least. Besides, you heard Arista doesn't matter who goes first. You know who else isn't on the list?" Fannin asked Lord Rufus. "Yeah, I saw that. Thought he'd be the one to challenge. Ending it would have been worth the trip just to see that deal. He's not even out in the yard with the rest. He's been with the Archbishop a lot from their elevated position." Arista scanned the courtyard below. The light was gone from the yard, the walls and trees casting the interior in shade. Men went around lighting torches and mounting them. There were hundreds assembled within the grounds and more outside, all gathered into small groups. They talked, some shouted. She could hear laughter and even a bit of singing. She couldn't tell the song, but by its rhythm she guessed it was a body tavern tune. There was a lot of toasting going on. Dark figures in the failing light. Broad, powerful man slamming cups together with enough force to spill foam above it all. On a wooden platform raised in the center of the yard stood Sentinel Louis Sky. He was high enough to catch the last rays of the sun and the last breaths of the evening wind. The light made his red cassock look like fire, and the wind blowing his cape lent him an ominous quality. She looked back at the brothers. Marvin had his mouth open, struggling to clear something from a back tooth with his forefinger. Fannin had his head up, looking at the sky. She was glad they were with her. It was a little bit of home in the wilderness, and she imagined the smell of apples. Arista and Ulrich had spent summer months at Drondel Fields to escape the heat of the city. She remembered how they used to climb the trees and the orchard outside the country castle and have apple fights in early autumn. The rotten apples would burst in the branches and spray pulp soaking them until they all smelled like cider. Each tree a sovereign castle. They would make alliances. Marvin always teamed with Ulrich, shouting, my king, Linaire," paired with Fannin wanting to protect her younger brother from the brutes, as she called them. Arista always remained on her own, fighting both groups. Even when Linaire stopped climbing trees, it became the boys against the girls. She didn't mind, she didn't notice, she didn't even think about it. Until now, there was so much in her head, so much she needed to sort out. It had been hard to think, bouncing around in the coach with Bernice staring at her. She desperately wanted to talk to someone, if only to hear her own words aloud. The idea that Sally was a conspiracy was growing in her mind, despite her reluctance to accept it. If Sally could betray her father, who could be trusted? Could Ezra harden? Had he used her to escape? Was he responsible for her father's death? Now it seemed the old wizard was nearby somewhere, just outside the walls, perhaps spending the night in one of the village houses. She didn't know what to do or who to trust. Marvin found what he was looking for and flicked it from his finger over the wall. She opened her mouth to speak, hesitating to find the proper words to say. The whole trip there she had planned to discuss the issues raised at Irvine with the Pickerings. Well, Marvin, at least she closed her mouth and bit her lip once more, thinking back to the long-ago orchard, then the smell of apples. "There you are, Your Highness," Bernice said, rushing to her with a shore for her shoulders. "You shouldn't be out so late. It's not proper. Honestly, Bernice, you should have had children when you had the chance. This preoccupation with pampering me has got to stop." The old woman only smiled warmly. "I'm just looking after you, dear. You need looking after. This foul place is full of rough men. There's little but thin walls, and the grace of the Archbishop separating them from your virtue. The lady, such as yourself, is a strong temptation, and given the untamed surroundings of this wilderness, it could easily drive many a good man to acts of rashness." She glanced suspiciously at the brothers, who looked back sheepishly. "And there are more than a few here who I couldn't even describe as good men in the great castle. With a proper revenue, men can be kept at bay by holding them in awe of royalty. But here, my lady, in this barbaric, feral landscape, they will surely lose their heads." "Oh, Bernice, please, here we go." Fine, unsaid excitedly. As the last of the sun's light faded, the gates opened and surrendered, and his retinue of 2 squires and 3 pages rode out, torches flaming. They trotted to the open plain where the knight prepared to do battle. A shout rose from the crowd just then, and Arista looked up to see a dark shadow sweep Across the moonlit sky it drifted in like a hawk, a silhouette of wings and tail. The crowd murmured and gasped as it circled the castle, briefly moving hesitantly before having its attention caught by torches waved by surrender entourage. On the hillside it folded its wings and dove, falling out of the sky like an arrow aimed at the Knight of Chadwick. Torches moved frantically, and Arista thought she heard surrender level as Lance and charged forward. There were screams, cries of anguish and terror as one by one the torches in the field went out. Next shouted Louis Guy. The dwarf led them up the river path to where the moon revealed a large rock protruding out toward the water. To Hadrian it looked vaguely like the dull tip of a broad spear. Magnus thumped the dirt with his boot, then pointed toward the river. "We go in here, swim straight down about 20 feet. There's an opening in the bank. The tunnel runs right under us, curves down, then runs under the river to the tower. You can tell all that with your foot," Royce asked. Adrian looked down at Ezra Hardin. "How are you at swimming?" "I can't say I have the opportunity since," he said, lifting his arms, "but I can hold my breath a good long time. Drag me if necessary. Let me go first," Royce announced, his eyes on Magnus. He threw his coil of rope on the ground and tied one end around his waist. "Feed this out to me, but hang on to it. I don't know how swift the current is." "There's no current here," Magnus told him. "There's an underwater shelf that jots out, creating an eddy. It's like a little pond down there. You forgive me if I don't take your word for it. Once I'm done I'll give 3 tugs indicating that it's safe to follow. Tie off the end and follow the line down. If on the other hand I jump in and the rope runs out like you just caught a marlin, hold me back so I can personally kill him." The dwarf sighed. Royce slipped off his cloak, and with Hadrian holding the rope he descended into the river. As if you were rappelling down the side of a wall, he dropped and vanished under the dark water. Adrian felt the rope slip out gradually from between his fingers at his side. Magnus showed no signs of concern. The dwarf stood with his head cocked back, looking up at the sky. "What do you suppose it's doing tonight?" he asked. "Eating knights would be my guess," Hagen replied. "Let's just hope they keep the thing busy." Deeper and deeper the rope trolled out. Then it stopped. Adrian watched with a line enter the water. It made a little white trail as it cut the current. "Tug, tug, tug. That's it. He's in, patron. Announce you next, little man." Magnus glared at him. "Armored dwarf, get in the river." Magnus walked to the edge, holding his nose and pointing his toes. He jumped and disappeared with a plop. "That leaves you and me," Pedrian said, tying the end of the rope to a birch tree that leaned out a bit toward the river. "You go first, I'll follow." "See how well you do. If need be, I'll pull you through." The wizard nodded, and for the first time since Adrian had known him, he looked unsure of himself. Ezra Hardin took 3 deep breaths, rapidly blowing each out. On the 4th inhale he held it and jumped feet first. Adrian leapt and right after the water was cold, not icy or breathtaking, but colder than expected. The immediate shock caught Hadrian off guard. For an instant he kicked out with his feet, pointed his head down, and began to swim along the rope. Magnus had been right about the current. The water was still as a pond. He opened his eyes. Above him there was a faint blue-gray shimmer. Below it was black. Panic gripped Adrian when he realized he could not see Ezra Hardin. Almost in response, a faint light appeared directly below him. The wizard's robe gave off a blue-green glow as he swam, paddling with his feet and stroking with his arms. Despite the lack of hands, he made good headway. The light from the robe revealed the riverbank, and the rope running down it disappeared inside a dark hole. He watched the wizard slip through, and with his lungs starting to burn, followed him. Once inside, he kicked upward, and almost together their heads emerged from a quiet pool in a small cave. Royce of the other end of the rope tied to a rock. There was a lantern burning beside him. The single flame easily illuminated the room. The chamber was a natural cave with a tunnel leading out. Magnus stood off to the side, either studying the cavern walls or just keeping his distance from Royce. When Ezra Hardin surfaced, Royce hauled him out. "You might have had an easier time swimming if you'd taken off." Royce stopped as you saw the wizard's robe. It was dry. Hadrian climbed out of the pool, feeling the river water drizzle down his body. He could hear the drops echoing in the cave like a rainstorm. But Ezra Hardin was exactly as he had been before entering the river. With the exception of his hair and beard, he wasn't even damp. Hadron and Royce exchanged glances. but said nothing. Royce picked up his lantern. Coming short stuff, the dwarf grumbled, and taking hold of his beard, with both hands twisted a bit of water out. You realize, my friend, dwarves are an older and far more accomplished. Less chatter, more walking, Royce interrupted, pointing at the tunnel you lead. And you're not my friend. Traveling forward, they entered into a new world. The walls were smooth and seamless, as if cut by the flow of water. The glossy surface magnifies the light from Royce's lantern, making the curved interior surprisingly bright. So where are we? Adrian asked. Under the bank, not far below where we were standing before entering the water. Magnus told him. The tunnel here corkscrews down. Incredible, Hadrian said, looking about him in amazement of the sparkling walls. It's as though we're on the inside of a diamond. Just as the dwarf had predicted, the tunnel curved around and around, sloping down. Right about the time Hadrian lost all sense of direction, it stopped spinning and ran straight. It wasn't long before they could hear and feel the thunder of the falls. It vibrated through the stone here. The ceiling and walls seeped to water. 1,000 years of neglect had allowed stalactites of crystal to form on the ceiling and jagged mounds of mineral deposits on the floor. This is a bit disturbing, Adrian remarked, noticing a buildup of water on the floor that was getting deeper as they moved forward. Magnus muttered, but failed to add anything more. They slogged through the water, dodging stone spikes. Examining the walls, Hadrian noticed designs carved into them, etchings of geometric shapes and patterns. Lines the corridor. Some of the more delicate lines were faded, missing, perhaps lost to the erosion of a billion water droplets. No words were visible, and there were no recognizable symbols. The etching appeared to be nothing more than decorative. Above, almost lost in the growing stone, were brackets for what might once have been banner poles, and on the side walls he spotted mountains for lamps. Hadron tried to imagine how the tunnel looked before the time of Navran, when multicolored banners and rows of bright lamps might have illuminated the causeway. It wasn't long before the tunnel pitched upward again, and they could all see a faint light. The tunnel ended at a stairway. Going up, the steps curved and were wide enough for them to take to strides before climbing the next step. When they reached the top, the star-filled sky was above them once more, and before long they stood above ground on the outcropping of rock that made up the base of the citadel. Strong wind met them. The gale was damp, filled with wet mist. They stood at the end of a short stone bridge, spanning a narrow crevice, beyond which stood the spires of the monolithic tower. It loomed above them so high it was impossible to see the top. More stairs awaited them on the far side, and they moved at the slow but even pace, staying single file. Even though the stairs were wide enough for 2 or even 3 to walk abreast, they climbed 5 sets of steps, zigzagging in a half circle around the outside of the tower. As they started their 6th flight, Royce waited until they had moved to the lee of the citadel, then called a halt for them to catch their breath. Below, the roar of the falls boomed, but from their perch, protected from the wind, the night seemed still. There were no sounds, no crickets or owls, just the deep voice of the river and the howl of the wind. This is ridiculous, voice shattered over the roar. Where's the damn door? I don't like being so exposed. It's just up ahead, not too much farther, Ezra Hayden replied. How long do we have? Hadrian asked, looking at the wizard, who shrugged in reply. Does it return here directly after killing, or does it enjoy the night? Voice inquired. I should think, having been locked up in this tower for 900 years, it would want to spend some time flying about. It isn't a person or an animal. It's a conjuration, a mystic embodiment of power. It mimics life and understands threats to its existence, certainly, but I doubt it has any concept of pleasure or freedom. Like I said, it's not alive. Then why does it eat? Royce asked. It doesn't. Then why is it killing a person or to a knight? I've wondered that myself. It should attempt to fulfill its last instructions, and that was clearly to kill the emperor. It is possible that, not finding its target and not able to travel far from this tower, conjurations are often limited to a specific distance from the creator or point of origin. It might be trying to lure him here. It could have deduced that the emperor would not tolerate the slaughter of his people and would come to aid the village regardless. We'd better be quick, patron concluded. The wind resumed. As they circled around, it whistled in their ears and buffeted their steps. The damp clothes chilled them. Despite the hard work of the march, above, the spires still rose far into the night sky, and they all felt a Grim sense of drudgery when they reached yet another short bridge, which ended abruptly at a solid wall. Adrian watched Royce sigh in disappointment. As he looked at the dead end, I thought you said there was a door. Royce addressed the wizard. There was. And as Hadrian didn't see a door, there was what appeared to be a faint outline of a door's frame etched in the wall in front of them. But it was solid stone. Royce grimaced. Another invisible stone portal. Don't waste your time. Magnus told him, you'll never open it. Trust me, I'm a dwarf. I spent hours trying to get in, and nothing. That stone is enchanted and impenetrable. Crossing the river to get here was nothing compared to opening that door. Royce turned to the door for the puzzled look in his eyes. You've been here. You tried to enter the tower. Why, I told you I was doing a job for the church. You said you made Lord Rufus a sword. I did, but the Archbishop didn't want just any sword made for him. He wanted a replica of a sword, an elfish sword. He gave me a bunch of old drawings which I used to make it. They were pretty good with dimensions and materials listed, but it's not like being able to examine the real thing. The dwarf's stare lingered on Roy suggestively. I was told others of the same type could be found inside this tower. I came out here and spent all day climbing around, but never found a way in. No doors or windows, just things like this. This sword you made, Ezra had, and said, did it have writing on the blade? Yep. Magnus replied. They were real insistent that the inscription on the replica was exactly like that in the books. That said, Ezra hard and muttered, the church isn't here because of me, and they aren't here to find the heir. They're here to make an heir. Make an heir? I don't get it. Agent said, I thought you said they wanted the heir dead. They do, but they're going to make a puppet. This Rufus has been picked to replace the true heir. There is a legend that only the bloodline of Navran can kill a Galara brand. They'll use this creature's death as undisputed proof that their boy is the true heir. Not only will it provide them legitimate means to dictate laws to the kings, but it will also hinder my efforts to reinstate the real heir to power, who will believe an old outlawed wizard. When their boys slew a Galara brand, they let a few bumpkins try to fight only to die in order to prove the invincibility of the beast. Then this Rufus will step up with his sword etched with the name. He'll slay it and become emperor with Rufus as the figurehead. The charge will return to power and reform the empire. Excellent move, I must say. I'll admit I hadn't expected it. Few moderate kings might have something to say about that, Hadron replied. And they know that as much as you do. They have a plan to deal with it. I'm sure so. Do we still need to get inside? Hadron asked. Oh yes, the wizard told them, now more than ever. He chuckled. Just imagine if before their boy Rufus slays this beast, another contestant slays it first. The dwarf snorted. I told you, you aren't getting through that door. It's solid stone. The wizard considered the archway once more. Open it. Royce looked skeptical. Open? What? That's a war. There's no latch, no lock, not even a seam. Anyone have a gem? We can try. This isn't a gem lock, the wizard explained. I agree. When I would know. Magnus told them, try opening it anyway. The wizard insisted, staring at Royce. That's why I brought you here. Remember? Royce looked at the wall before him and scowled. How? Use your instinct. You opened the door to my prison, and it had no latch either. I was lucky. You might be lucky. Again, try. Royce shrugged. He stepped forward and placed his hands lightly on the stone, letting his fingertips drift across the surface, searching by feel for what his eyes might not be able to see. This is a waste of time, Magnus said. This is clearly a very powerful lock, and without the key there's no way to open it. But I know these things. I've made these things. They are designed to prevent thieves like him from entering. Ezra Hardin said to the dwarf. But you underestimate Royce. He's no ordinary lock picker. I sense it the moment I first saw him. I know he can open it. The wizard turned to Royce, who was quickly showing signs of exasperation. Stop trying to open it and just open it. Don't think about it, just do it. Do what he asked, irritated. If I knew how, don't you think I would have opened it by now? That's just it. Don't think. Stop being a thief. Just open the door. Royce glared at the wizard. Fine, he said as he pushed his palm against the stone wall and pulled it back with a look of shock on his face. Ezra Hardin's expression was one of sheer delight. I knew it, the wizard said. You? What happened? Hayden asked. I just pushed. Royce laughed at the absurdity. And what you mean? And Royce asked, pointing at the solid wall. And what happened? Why are you smiling? Hadrian studied the wall for something. He missed a tiny crack, a little latch, a keyhole. But he saw nothing. It was the same as it had always been at open. Royce said Adrian, and the dwarf looked at Royce puzzled. What are you talking about? Royce looked back over his shoulder as if that would make everything clear. Are you both blind? The door is standing wide open. You can see there's a corridor that they can't see it. The wizard interrupted. Royce looked from the wizard to Hadrian. You can't see that the door is standing open now? You can't see this huge 3-story double door? Adrian shook his head. It looks just like it always has. Magnus nodded his agreement. They can't see it because they can't enter, the wizard explained. Adrian watched Royce look up following the wizard's glance, and Royce's eyes widened. But patron asked, elven magic designed to prevent enemies from passing through these walls. All they see and all they will encounter is solid stone. The portal is close to them. You can see it? Royce asked Ezra Hayden. Oh yes, quite plainly. So why is it we can see it and they can't? I already told you it's magic to stop enemies from entering. As it happens, I was invited into this tower 900 years ago. It was abandoned immediately after my visit, so I'm guessing there was no one to revoke that permission. He looked back at what Hadrian still saw as solid stone. I don't think I could have opened it though, even if I had hands. That's why I needed you. Me, Roy said. Then a sudden shocked realization filled his expression, and he glared at the wizard before him. So you knew I wouldn't be much of a wizard if I didn't, now would I? Royce looked self-consciously at his own feet, then slowly turned to look cautiously at Hadrian. Wong, who smiled. You knew to Hadrian frowned. Did you really think I could work with you all these years and not figure it out? It's a little obvious. You know, you never said anything, but I figured you didn't want to talk about it. You guard your past jealously, pal, and you've many doors in which I don't knock. Honestly, there were times I wondered if you knew what's going on. Magnus demanded. None of your business, Agent told the dwarf. But it does leave us with a parting of the ways, doesn't it? We can't come in, and I can tell you I'm not fond of sitting here on the doorstep waiting for the flying lizard to come home. You should go back, Ezra had, and told them, Royce, and I can go on from here alone. How long will this take? Agent asked. Several hours a day, perhaps, the wizard replied. I had hoped to be gone before it returned. Roy said, not possible. Besides, this shouldn't be a problem for you of all people. I'm certain you've stolen from occupied homeless before. Not once where the owner can swallow me in a single bite, so we'll have to be extra quiet now, won't we? Chapter 10 Lost Swords. I thought last night went well, Bishop Saldo stated, slicing himself a wedge of breakfast cheese. He sat at the banquet table in the great hall of the manor, along with Archbishop Gallian, Sentinel Louis Skye, and Lord Rufus. The lofty cathedral ceiling of bound logs did little to elevate the dark, oppressive atmosphere caused by the lack of natural light. The entire manor had few windows and made Sodder feel as if you were crouching in an animal's den. Some woodchucks burrow or beavers lodge. The thought that this miserable hovel would see the birth of the new empire was a disappointment. But he was a pragmatic man. The method was irrelevant. All that mattered was the final solution. Either it worked or it did not. This was the only measure of value. Aesthetics could be added later. Right now they needed to establish the empire. Mankind had drifted too long without a rudder. A firm hand was what the world needed, a solid grip on the wheel. With a keen set of eyes that could see into the future and direct the vessel into clear, tranquil waters, Soldier envisioned a world of peace through prosperity and security through strength. The feudal system, so prevalent across the four nations, held them back, chaining the kingdoms to a poverty of weakness and divided interests. What they needed was a centralized government with an enlightened ruler and a talented, educated bureaucracy overseeing every aspect of life. It was impossible to imagine the many girls that could be accomplished with the entire strength of mankind under one yoke. They could revolutionize farming, its fruits distributed evenly at a price that even the poorest could afford. Vanquishing hunger. Laws could be standardized, eliminating arbitrary punishment by vindictive tyrants. Knowledge from the corners of the land could be gathered into a single repository where great minds could learn and develop new ideas, new techniques. They could improve transportation with standardized roads, and they could clear the stench of cities with standardized sewage systems. If all this had to begin here in this little wood hut on the edge of the world, it was a small price To pay how many died, he asked. The Archbishop shrugged, and Rufus didn't bother looking up from his plate. 5 contestants were killed by the beast last night. Louis Sky answered his question as he plucked a muffin off the table with the point of his dagger. The Knight of Nephron continued to impress Sauter. He was a sword manifested in the form of a man, sharp-pointed cutting, and just as elegant in appearance. He always stood straight, shoulders back, chin up, eyes focused directly on his target, his face a hard chiseled mask of contention, daring, almost begging for a confrontation from anyone fool enough to challenge him. Even after days in the wilderness, not a thread lay out of place. He was a paragon of the church, the embodiment of an ideal. Only 5. After the 5th was ripped into, few were eager to step forward, and while they hesitated, the beast flew off. Do you think 5 deaths are sufficient to prove the beast is invincible? Galleon asked, looking at all of them. No, but we may have no choice after last night, and not certain anymore. Will volunteer, Guy replied. The previously witnessed enthusiasm for the hunt has waned. And will you be ready, Lord Rufus, if no one else steps forward? The Archbishop asked, turning to the rough warrior seated at the end of the table. Lord Rufus looked up. He was taking full advantage of the meal, chewing on a mutton leg that slicked his unruly beard with grease. His eyes stared at them from beneath the heavy hedges of his bushy red eyebrows. He spit a bit of bone out. Lot of pants, he said. This sword the dwarf made cannot cut the beastie's hide. We had our scribes check the dwarf's work against the ancient records, Sauter replied. They match perfectly with the markings recorded on previous weapons that were capable of killing beasts of this kind. If it can cut it, I'll kill it. Rufus grinned a greasy smile. Just be ready to crown me emperor. He bit into the leg again and ripped a large hunk of dark meat off, filling his mouth. Sauter could hardly believe the patriarch had chosen this oath to be the emperor. If Guy was a sword, Rufus was a mallet, a blunt instrument of dull labor. Being a native of Trent, he would ensure the loyalty of the unruly northern kingdoms that most likely couldn't be gained any other way, that would easily double their strength. Going in there was also his popularity, which extended down through Avon and Calais. This reduced the number of protests against him. The fact that he was a renowned warrior would certainly help him in his first obstacles of killing the Galara Bryn and crushing any opposition offered by the nationalists. The problem as soldier sword was that Rufus, a rough, unreasonable adult, had not only the heart of a warrior, but the mind as well. His answer to every problem was beating it to death. It would be hard to control him, but it made little sense to worry about the headaches of administrating an empire. Before one even existed, they needed to create it first and worry about the quality of the emperor later. If Rufus became a problem, they could merely ensure that once he had a son, and once that son was safe in their custody, Rufus could meet an untimely end. Well then, Galleon said, it would seem everything is in hand. Is that all you called me here for? Guy asked with the tone of irritation. No, Galleon replied. I received some unexpected news this morning, and I thought you might like to hear of it. Louise, as I suspected, will interest you very much. Carlton, will you ask the Deacon Thomas to come in? Galleon's steward Carlton, who was busy pouring watered down wine, promptly left the table and opened the door to the hallway. His Grace will see you now, and walked a plump, pudgy man in a priest's frock. Louis. Guy, Lord Rufus, let me introduce Deacon Thomas of Dalgren Village. Thomas, this is Lord Rufus, Sentinel Guy, and you already know Bishop Sauter, of course. Thomas nodded with a nervous smile. What's this all about? Guy asked, as if Thomas wasn't there. Go ahead, Thomas, tell the Sentinel what you told me. The deacon shifted his feet and avoided eye contact with anyone in the room. When he spoke, his voice was so soft they strained to hear him. I was just mentioning to His Grace how I had stepped up and handled things here in the absence of the Margrave. It has been hard times in this village, hard indeed, but I tried my best to keep the great house in order. It wasn't my idea that they should invade the place. I tried to stop them, but I'm only one man, you see. It was impossible. Yes, yes, tell him about the cripple, the Archbishop put in. Oh, certainly. Ah, yes. Ezra came to live here, I don't know, about a month ago. Ezra, Guy said, and glanced abruptly at the Archbishop and Sauter, who both smiled knowingly at him. Yes, Deacon Thomas replied. That's his name. You never said too much, but the villagers are a good lord, and they took turns feeding him as the poor man was in dire straits, missing both hands as he is. Ezra Hardin guy hissed, "Where's the snake?" The sudden violent reaction of the sentinel shocked Thomas, who took a step back. Well, I don't know. He comes and goes, although I remember he was around the village a lot more before the two strangers arrived. Strangers, Guy asked. Friends of the Wood family. I think at least they arrived with Ray's and spend a lot of time with her and her father since they got here. Ezra spends most of his days off with the quiet one, Royce. I think they call him Royce Melbourne, and Hadrian Blackwater, the two thieves that broke the wizard out of Guittara, and Ezra Hardin are all here in this village. Saldor and Gallion nodded at Louise. Very curious, isn't it? The Archbishop commented. Perhaps we focused on the wrong hound when we approached Arista. It looks as if the old wizard has put his trust in the two thieves. Instead, the real question is, why would they all be here? It can't be coincidence that he turns up in this little backwater village at the precise moment when the Emperor is about to be crowned. He couldn't know of our plans. Guy told him he is a wizard. They're good at discovering things. Regardless, you might want to see if you can determine what he's up to. Remember to keep your distance. Sold. Or added, we don't want to tree this fox until we know he's led us to his den. Adrian folded the blanket twice in length, then rolled it tight, buckling the resulting cloth log with two leather straps, hid all the gear left to them on the ground in neat piles. They still had all their camping gear, food and feed. Royce had his saddle, bridle and bags, but Adrian had lost his tack along with his weapons. When Millie had disappeared, it would be impossible to ride double and hold the gear. They would have to load Mouse up with everything and walk the trip home. There you are. Hedron looked up to see Theron striding from the direction of the Botherwicks, heading for the well with an empty bucket in his hand. We didn't see you around last night. Was worried something happened to you. Looks like everyone had a lucky night. Adrian said. Everyone in the village? Yeah, but I don't think them fellows up of the castle did so well. We heard a lot of shouting and screaming, and they ain't celebrating this morning. My guess is their plan to kill the beast didn't go as hoped. The farmer scans the piles. Packing. So you're leaving too? I don't see why not. There's nothing keeping us here anymore. How's Thrice doing? Well, rubbing elbows with the nobility. She tells me she's walking around just fine. The headaches are mostly gone. We'll be on our way tomorrow morning. I expect. Good to hear that. Had you said who's your friend there? In motion to the dwarf seated a few feet away in the shade of a poplar tree. Oh yeah, Theron. Meet Magnus. He's not so much a friend as an associate. He thought about that and added, actually, he's more like an enemy. I'm keeping an eye on. Theron nodded, but with a puzzled look, and the dwarf grumbles something neither caught. What about my lesson? Theron asked. Are you kidding? I don't really see the point in a lesson if you're both leaving tomorrow. You have something else to do besides. The road is a dangerous place, and it wouldn't hurt to know a few more tricks. Or is this your way of saying you want money? No. Adrian waved his hand at the farmer. Grabbed the sticks. By noon the sun was hot, and Adrian had worked up a sweat sparring with Theron, who was showing real improvement. Magnus sat on an overturned well bucket watching the two with interest. Hedron explained proper form, how to obtain penetrating thrusts and grips, which was hard using only rake handles. If you hold a sword with both hands you lose versatility and reach, but you gain tremendous power. A good fighter knows when to switch from two hands to one, and vice versa. If you're defending against someone with longer reach, you'd better be using one hand. But if you need to drive your sword deep through heavy armor, assuming you aren't holding a shield in your offhand, grip the palmer with both palms and thrust. Remember to yell as you do so, like I told you before, then drive home the blow using all your power. A solid breastplate won't stop a sword thrust. They aren't designed to. Armor prevents a swing or a slice and can deflect the point of a thrust. That's why professional fighters wear smooth, unadorned armor. You always see these princes and dukes with all their fancy gilded breastplates and like thin metal heavily engraved. It's like walking around in a death trap. Of course, they don't really fight. They have knights do that for them. They just walk around and look pretty. So the idea is when you thrust, you aim for a crease, groove, or seam in the armor, something that'll catch and hold the tip. The armpits are excellent targets. Are up under the nose guard. Drive a 4-foot sword up under a nose guard, and you don't have to worry much about a counterattack. How can you teach that poor fellow anything without swords? They both turned to see Marvin Pickering walking toward them in a simple blue tunic. Gone was the dapper Lord of Galilean. Instead, he looked much like the boy Hadrian had first seen at Drondel Fields. In his hands he carried two swords, and slung over his back with two small round shields. I saw you from the walls and thought you might like to borrow these, he said, handing a sword and shield to Theron, who accepted them awkwardly. They are mine, Fanon's. Spares. Theron eyed the young man suspiciously, then looked to Hadron. Go ahead, Hadron told him, wiping the sweat from his brow with a sleeve. He's right, you should know the feel of the real thing. When Theron appeared confused by how to hold the shield, Marvin began instructing him, showing the farmer where his arm slipped through the leather straps. See, Adrian, it helps to actually teach your pupil how to put on a real shield, unless of course you expect he'll be spending all of his time warring against maple trees. Where are your weapons anyway? Adrian looked sheepish. I lost them. Don't you carry enough for 5 people? I've had a bad week. And who might you be? Marvin asked, looking at the dwarf. Hadrian started to answer, then stopped himself. Ulrich had likely told Marvin all about the dwarf who had murdered his father. He's nobody, okay? Marvin laughed, raising his hand and waving. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Nobody. He then went and sat on the edge of the well, but he folded his arms across his chest. Go on, show me what he's taught you, Adrian. And Theron returned to fighting, but slower now, as the sharp swords made Theron nervous. He soon became frustrated and turned to Marvin, scowling. You any good with these things? The young man raised an eyebrow in surprise. My dear sir, weren't we already introduced? My name is Marvin Pickering. He grinned. Theron narrowed his eyes in confusion, glanced at Hadrian, who said nothing, then faced the boy once more. I asked if you knew how to use a sword, son, not your name. But oh, never mind. Yes, I've been trained in the use of a sword. Well, I spent all my life on farms and villages not much bigger than this one, and I've never had much chance to see fellas beating each other with blades. It might help if Annoy was to see what I'm supposed to be doing, you know, all proper, like you want a demonstration there. And nodded. I've no way of knowing if Adrian here even knows what he's doing. All right, Marvin said, flexing his fingers and shaking his hands as he walked forward. He had a bright smile on his face, as if Theron had just invited him to play his favorite game. The two paired off. Magnus and Theron took seats in the dirt and watched as Marvin and Hadron first walked through the basic moves and then demonstrated each at actual combat speed. Hadron would explain each maneuver and comment on the action afterwards. See there, Marvin thought I was going to slice inward toward his thigh and dropped his guard briefly. He did that because I told him to, by suggesting with the dip of my shoulder that this was my intention. So before I even started my stroke, I knew what Marvin was going to do, because I was the one dictating it. In essence, I knew what he would do before he did, and in battle, that's very handy enough. Of the lessons, Marvin said, clearly irritated at being the illustration of a fencing mistake. Let's show him a real demonstration. Looking for a rematch? Hadron asked, curious if it was luck. Hadron smiled and muttered, Pickering's. He took off his shirt and, wiping his face and hands, threw it on the grass and raised his sword to ready position. Marvin lunged, and immediately the two began to fight. The sword sang as they cut the air, so fast the movements blurred. Adrian and Marvin danced around on the boards of their feet, shuffling in the dirt so briskly that a small cloud rose to knee height. Mimar, the old farmer exclaimed. Then abruptly they stopped, both panting from the exertion. Marvin glared at Hadron with the look that was both amazed and irritated. You're playing with me? I thought that was the point. You don't really want me to kill you? Well, no, but well, like he said, by Ma, I've never seen anyone fight like you do. You're amazing. I thought you both were pretty amazing, Theron remarked. Oh, you've never seen anything like it. I have to agree, Magnus chimed in. The dwarf was on his feet, nodding his head. Hadrian walked over to the well and poured half a bucket over himself, then shook the water from his hair seriously. Hadrian, Marvin asked, where did you learn it? From a man named Danbury Blackwater. Blackwater, isn't that your name? Adrian nodded, and the melancholy look stole over his face. He was my father. Was he died? Was he warrior? A general blacksmith? Blacksmith, more than asked in disbelief. In a village not much bigger than this, you? No, the guy who makes horseshoes, rakes pots. Are you telling me a village blacksmith knew the secret disciplines of the test laws? I recognize the tech chin moves, the ones my father taught me. The rest I can only assume were from the other lost disciplines of the test laws. Marvin drew blank stares from everyone the test floors. He looked around, more stares. He rolled his eyes. Inside, heathens. I'm surrounded by ignorant heathens. The test laws were the greatest knights ever to have lived. They were the personal bodyguards of the emperor. It said they were taught the 5 disciplines of combat from Navrin himself, only one of which is the tech chin. And the knowledge of the tech chin alone is what has made a legend out of the Pickering dynasty. Your father clearly knew the tech chin and apparently other Tesla disciplines that I thought had been lost for nearly 1,000 years, and you're telling me he was a blacksmith. He was probably the greatest warrior of his time, and you don't know what your father did before you were born. I assume the same thing he did afterward. Then how did he know how to fight? Hadrian considered this. I just assumed he picked it up serving in the local army. Several of the men in the village served his lordship as men at arms. I assumed he saw combat. He used to talk like he had. Did you ever ask him? The thunder of hooves interrupted them as 3 men on horseback entered the village from the direction of the Margrave's castle. The riders were all in black and red, with the symbol of a broken crown on their chest. At their head rode a tall, thin man with long black hair and a short, trimmed beard. Excellent swordsmanship, the lead man said. He rode right up to Hadron and reined in his animal roughly. The black stallion was draped in a scarlet and black comparison, complete with braided tassels, a scarlet headpiece with a foot-tall black plume spouting from his head. The horse snorted and stomped. I was wondering why the son of Count Bickering wasn't partaking in the combat today. But I see now you found a worthy partner to spar against. Who would this delightful warrior be? And why haven't I seen you at the castle? I'm not here to compete for the crown, Adrian said, simply slipping on his shirt. No pity. You certainly appear to be worthy of a chance. What's your name? Hadrian. Ah, good to meet you, Sir Hadrian. Just Hadrian, I see. Do you live here? Just Hadrian. No. The horseman seemed less than pleased with the curt answer and nudged his horse closer in a menacing manner. The animal puffed out a hot, moist breath into Adrian's face. Then, what are you doing here? Just passing through, Adrian replied in his usual amiable manner. He even managed a friendly little smile. Really just passing through Daldarin? To where in the world, might I ask? Is Daldarin on the way? Just about everywhere, depending on your perspective. Don't you think I mean all roads lead somewhere, don't they? He was tired of being on the defensive and took a verbal swing. Is there a reason you're so interested? I'm Sentinel Louis Guy, and I'm in charge of managing the contest. I need to know of everyone participating. As listed, I already told you I wasn't here for the contest. So you did, Guy said, and slowly looked around at the others, taking particular notice of Magnus. You are just passing through, you said, but perhaps those traveling with you wish to be listed on the roll. A feint, perhaps. Adrian decided to parry anyway. No one I'm with will want to be on that list. No one you're with. Adrian gritted his teeth. It was a feint. Adrian mentally scolded himself. So you're not alone, the sentinel observed. Where are the others? I couldn't tell you. No. Adrian shook his head. Fewer words, smaller chance of mistakes. Really, you mean they could be washing over the falls right now, and you couldn't care less? I didn't say that, Hadron replied, irritated. But you see no need to know where they are. They're grown men. The sentinel smiled. And who are these men? Please tell me so that I might inquire of them later. Perhaps. Adrian's eyes narrow. Does he realize too late his mistake? The man before him was clever to clever. Did you forget their names? To Louis Guy inquired, leaning forward in his saddle. No. Hadron tried to hold him off while he struggled to think. Then, are they? Well, he began wishing he had his own swords rather than a borrowed one. Like I said, I don't know where both of them are. Marvin is here, of course, but I've no idea where Fannin has got to. Surely you are mistaken. The Pickerings traveled with me and the rest of the entourage, Guy pointed out. Yes, they were, but they're planning on returning home with me. Guy's eyes narrowed. So you are saying that you traveled all the way out here alone, passing through as you put it, and just happened to join up with the Pickerings? Hadrian smiled at the sentinel. It was weak, clumsy, and the fencing equivalent of dropping a sword and tackling his opponent to the ground. But it was all he could do. Is this true, Pickering? Absolutely, Marvin replied. Without hesitation, Guy looked back at Adrian. How convenient for you, he said, disappointed. Well, then don't let me keep you from your practice. Good day, gentlemen. They all watched as the three men rode off toward the river trail. That was creepy, Marvin remarked, staring off in their direction. It can never be good when any sentinel takes an interest in you, much less Louis. Guy, what's his story? Adrian asked. I really only know rumors. He's a zealot for the church, but I know many even in the church were scared of him. He's the kind of person that can make kings disappear. He's also rumored to be obsessed with finding the heir of Navran. Aren't all Saray according to church doctrine? Sure, but he really is, which explains why he's here. And the two with him, Saray, the Knights of Nephron. They are the Sentinels' personal shadow army. They're answerable to no king or nation, just to Sentinels. And the Patriarch. Marvin looked at Hagen. You might want to keep that sword. It looks like a bad time to be without your weapons. Although he had put his lantern out long before the creature's return, Royce could see just fine light permeated the walls of Avanpartha, seeping through the stone. As if it was smoky glass, it was daylight. Outside of that, he was certain, as the color of light had changed from dim blue to soft white. As the sun rose, the interior of the citadel became an illuminated world of wondrous color and beauty. Ceilings stretched in tall, airy arches, meeting hundreds of feet above the floor and giving the illusion of not being indoors at all, but rather in a place where the horizon was merely lost in mist. The roar of the nearby cataracts, tamed by the walls of the tower, was a soft, muffled, undeniably soothing hum. Thin gossamer banners hung from the lofty heights, each shimmered with symbols Royce didn't understand. There might have been standards of royalty, rules of law, directions to halls, or meaningless decorations. All Royce knew was that even in the wake of 1,000 years, the detailed patterns still appeared fluid and vibrant. It was artistry beyond mortal hands, born of a culture unfathomable. Being the only elven structure Royce had ever entered, it was his only glimpse into that world, and it felt oddly peaceful, still and silent. It was beautiful. Although it looked nothing like anything Royce had ever seen, his reason fought against the growing sensation that somehow all this was familiar. Royce felt calm as he wandered the corridors. The very shapes and shadows touched chords in his mind he never realized were there. It all spoke to him in a language he couldn't understand. He called only a word or a phrase in an avalanche of sensations that both mystified and captivated him. As he wandered aimlessly, like a man blinded by a dazzling light, he walked from room to room, upstairs and across balconies, following no conscious course, but merely moving, staring and listening. Royce noticed with concern that every movement he made was recorded clearly in centuries of dust that blanketed the interior. Still, he was fascinated to discover that where he disturbed the dust, the floor of yielded a glossy surface as clear as still water. Passing through the various chambers, he felt as if he were in a museum, lost in a moment of frozen time. Plates were still out before empty chairs, some fallen on their sides, overturned, and the confusion and alarm of nearly a millennium earlier. Books lay open to pages someone had been reading 900 years before. Yet Royce knew that even to that person who had sat there so long ago, this place, this tower, had been ancient. Aside from its dramatic history, by its age alone, Avanpartha would be a monument, a sacred structure to the elves, a link to an ancient era. This was not a citadel. He didn't know how he knew, but he was certain this was something far more than a mere fortress. Ezra Hayden had left Royce almost immediately after entering the tower and pointing him in the direction he was now following. He had told Royce that he would find the sword he sought somewhere above the entrance, but that the wizard's path led elsewhere. It had been hours now since they had parted, and the light outside was already starting to dim. Royce still hadn't found the sword. Sights, sounds, and smells sidetracked him. It was too much to process at once, too much to classify, and soon he found himself lost. He started to follow his trail in reverse when he discovered his footprints overlapped, leaving him a path that moved in circles. He was starting to become concerned when he heard a new sound unlike everything he had encountered. So far, this noise was disturbing. It was the thick rhythmical resonance of heavy breathing. Every path open to the thief was marred with his own tracks, except one that led to yet another stair, with the breathing was louder. How many floors up? Royce had wondered. He wasn't certain, but he knew he hadn't come across any swords. Slowly, and as silently as he could, he began to creep upward. He hadn't gone more than 5 steps when he spotted his first sword. It lay blanketed in dust. On one side, beside a bony form, what cloth there might have been was gone. But the armor remained. Farther up, he spotted another, and yet another. There were 2 different types of bodies, human and broad, heavy breastplates and greaves, and elves in delicate blue armor. This was the last stand, the last defense, to protect the Emperor. Elves and men fallen one upon the other. Royce reached down and slid his thumb along the flat of the blade at his feet as the dust wiped clear. The amazing shine of the elven steel glimmered as if new, but no etching was on it. Royce looked up the stairs and reluctantly stepped over the bodies. As he continued his climb, the breathing grew louder and deeper, like wind blowing through an echoing cavern. A room lay ahead, and with the silence of a cat's shadow, Royce crept inside. The chamber was round with yet another staircase leading up. As he entered, he could feel and smell fresh air. Tall, thin windows allowed unfettered shafts of light into the room, but Royce felt that somewhere above him a much larger window lay. At last Royce found a rack of elven swords mounted ceremoniously to the wall in ornate cases, divided from the rest of the room by a delicate chain. The area appeared as a memorial, a remembrance set aside in honor. A plaque on a pedestal stood before the rack, and on the walls were numerous lines of elven script carved into the stone. Royce knew only a few words, and those before him had been written with such flair and embellishment that he was at a loss to recognize even a single word. Although he was certainly recognized several letters on the rack were dozens of swords. They all appeared to be identical, and without having to touch them, Royce could see the etchings clearly cut into the blades, and the notches hewn into the metal. One spot remained vacant. With a silent sigh, he steadied himself and began to climb upward once more. With each step, the air grew fresher. Current Spanish dust to the cracks and corners along the stair. More openings and hallways appeared to either side. But Royce had a hunch and continued to climb, moving toward the sound of breathing. At last the steps ended, and Royce looked up. At open sky above him was a circular balcony with sculpted walls like petals on a flower. Statues that had once lined this open-air pavilion lay in broken heaps on the floor. At the center rested the malevolent sleeping figure of the Galara Bryn, an enormous black-scaled lizard with wings of gray membrane and bone. It lay curled, its head on its tail, its body heaving with deep long breaths. Muscular claws were armed with 12-inch long black nails encrusted with dried blood. They left deep grooves on the surface of the floor where they scraped, and the beast's sleep. Long sharp fangs protruded from beneath leathery lips, as did a row of frightening teeth that followed no visible scheme, but seems to mesh together like a wild fence of needles. Ears lay back upon its head, its eyes cloaked by broad lids beneath which pupils darted about in a fretful slumber of what dark visitors. Royce couldn't begin to imagine. The long tail barbed at the end with a saber-like bone twitched. Royce caught himself staring and cursed at his own stupidity. It was a sight to be certain, but this was no time to be distracted. Focus was all that separated him from certain death. He'd always hated places with animals. Hounds bellowed at the slightest sound or smell. He had managed to step past many a sleeping dog, but there had been a few that had managed to sense him. Without warning, he mentally gripped himself and pulled his eyes away from the giant to study the rest of the room. It was a shambles, broken fixtures and rubble. And closer study, however, Royce noticed that the rubble held terrible treasures. He recognized torn bits of Maid Drundle's dress, mattered with dark stains. Entangled within its folds was a bit of scalp and a long lock of gray hair. Other equally disturbing items lay around him, arms, feet, fingers, hands, all cast aside like shrimp tails. He spotted Millie Hadrian's bay mare, or rather one of her rear legs, and her tail not too far away. He was stunned to see Millie's saddle and Hadrian's swords. Luckily, they were within easy reach as he began to move around the pile, inching his way with the slow discipline of a mantis on the hunt. He saw something. The body isn't torn close lay atop the pile of bones and stone, but deep beneath on the bottom stratum of built-up sediment, Royce caught the singular glint of mirrored steel. It was only a tiny patch no larger than a small coin, which was what he initially took it for, but its brilliance was unmistakable. It possessed the same gleam as the swords on the stairs, and in the rack below, barely breathing, each movement keyed to a painfully slow pace that might defy even a direct look. Royce stole closer to the beast, and his vile treasure trove. He slipped his hand under the strands of Millie's tail and meticulously began to draw forth the blade. It came loose with a little effort or sound, but even before he had a tree, Royce knew something was wrong. It wasn't heavy enough, even given that elven blades might weigh dramatically less. It was ridiculously light. He soon realized why as he drew forth only part of a broken blade, seeing the etching on the unarched metal. Royce realized his hunch was correct. The Galara Bren was no animal, no dumb beast trained to kill. This conjured demon was self-aware enough to realize it had only one mortal fear in this world: a blade with its name on it. It took precautions. The monster had broken the blade, severing the name and rendering it useless. He couldn't see the other half of the sword, but it seemed obvious to him where it lay. The remainder of the sword rested in the one place from which Royce couldn't steal it, beneath the sleeping body of the Galarabrin itself. Chapter 11, Galara Brin. It was nearing dusk when Royce, hauling 3 swords over his shoulder, found Hadron and Magnus waiting at the well. The village was empty, its inhabitants holed up in their hovels, and the night was quiet except for the faint sounds of distant activity coming from the castle. "It's about time," Adrian said, jumping to his feet at Royce's approach. "Here's your gear." Royce handed Adrian his weapons. "Be careful next time where you stow it. I do have more important things to do than be your personal valet." Adrian happily took the swords and belts and began strapping them on. "I was starting to worry the church had grabbed you." "Church?" Royce asked. "Louis Guy was harassing me earlier." "The sentinel?" "Yeah, he was asking about my partners and rode off toward the river, and I haven't seen him come back. I got the impression he might be fishing for Ezra." "Where's Ezra anyway? Did you leave him at the river?" "He didn't stop back here," Royce asked. They shook their heads. "Doesn't mean anything. He'd be a fool to come back to the village. He's likely hiding in the trees, assuming he didn't get swept away by the river." Hadron said. "Why did you leave him?" "He left me with a very don't follow me attitude, which under normal circumstances would ensure that I followed him. But I'd other things on my mind. Before I knew it, the sun was going down. I thought he had already left." "So did you find anything valuable inside?" "Gems, gold." Royce suddenly felt stupid. "You know, it never even crossed my mind to look. What I completely forgot about it." "So what did you do in there all day?" Royce pulls the bare half blade from his belt. It gleamed even in the faint light. "All the other swords were in a neat display case, but I found this buried almost directly under the Galabrin's foot." "Its foot?" Adrian said, stunned. "You saw it?" Royce nodded with a grimace. "And trust me, it isn't a sight you want to see, drunk or sober. You think it broke the blade. Kinda makes you wonder, doesn't it?" "So where's the other piece?" "I'm guessing it's sleeping on it, but I wasn't about to try and roll it over to look. I'm surprised you didn't wait until it left with our clients leaving in the morning." "What's the point? If it was an easy grab, if I could see it and didn't have to spend hours digging through well stuff, fine, but I'm not about to risk my neck for Ezra's personal law with the church. Besides, remember the hands in Blythe and Castle?" Adrian nodded with a sick look on his face. "If it can smell sense, I didn't want it to be around when it wakes up the way I see it. Trace has her father. Ezra has access to the tower, and Rufus will rid the village of the Galara Brin. I say our work here is done." Royce looked at the dwarf, then back at Hadrian. "Thanks for keeping an eye on him." He drew his dagger. "We'll wait." The dwarf backpedaled as Royce advanced. "We had a deal." Royce screamed at him. "Do I really look trustworthy to you?" "Royce, she can't," Adrian said. The thief looked at him and chuckled. "Are you kidding? Look at him. If I can't slit his throat in 10 seconds, tops, I'll buy you a beer as soon as we get back to Albin. Tell me when you're ready to count." "No, I mean, he's right. You made a bargain with him. You can't go back on it." "Oh, please, this little dwarf tried to kill me and damn near succeeded. You want me to let him go because I said I would?" "Hey, he lived a whole day longer for helping us. That's plenty reward." Royce, what? The thief rolled his eyes. "You aren't serious. He killed Amrith. It was a job, and you aren't a member of the Royal Guard." He upheld his end just as agreed, and there's no benefit to killing him. "Enjoyment." Both said enjoyment and satisfaction or benefits. Hadron continued to glare. Roy shook his head inside. "All right, okay, he can live it. Stupid but he can live." Happy Royce looked up at the great mart of the castle. Already the torches of that night's contestants were assembling. "It's nearly dark. We need to get inside. Where's the best seat for this dinner theater? I hear they've been holding at the castle. When I say best, I mean safest. We still have an open invitation to the Botherwicks. Theron is there now, and we've been the screeching cry from the direction of the river cut through the night. What's in the land of Navrin's ghost is that Magnus asked. You think maybe Lizard Wings found out his rattle has been stolen?" Page and asked apprehensively. Royce looked back toward the trees and then at his friend. "I think we'd better find a better place to hide tonight than the Botherwicks." Where Adrian asked, "If it comes looking for that blade, it'll rip every house apart until it finds it. And we already know the local architecture doesn't pose much of a challenge. It's gonna kill everyone in the village. We could run them all to the castle. There might still be time." Well suggested. "No good." Pedro encountered. "The guards won't let us in the forest. Maybe the trees only slow it down. We don't stop it any more than the houses. Damn it." Adrian looked around desperately. "I should have built the pit out in the village. What about the well here?" the dwarf asked, peering into the wooden-rimmed hole. Royce and Adrian looked at each other. "I feel so stupid right now," Royce said. Adrian ran to the bell, grabbed hold of the dangling rope, and began to pull at the bell intended for the future church of Dargren. "Raise the alarm. Keep ringing it." Hadron yelled at Magnus as he and Royce raced to the houses, sweeping the cloth drapes aside and banging on the frames. "Get out, everyone out," they yelled. "Your houses won't protect you tonight. Get in the well." "Everyone in the well now. What's going on?" Russell Bob gasped, peering out into the darkness. "No time to explain," Adrian shattered back. "Get in the well if you want to live with the church. They're supposed to save us." Ellen Brockton sat huddling in a blanket in the arch of her doorway. "Are you willing to bet your life? You're all gonna have to trust me. If I'm wrong, you'll spend one miserable night, but if I'm right and you don't listen, you'll all die. That's good enough for me," Theron said, storming out of the Barthwick house, putting his shirt, his massive figure and loud harsh voice commanding everyone's attention. "And it had better be good enough for the lot of you too. Adrian has done more to save this village from death in the past few days than all of us and all of them combined. If he says sleep in the well tonight, then by the beard of Maribor, that's what I'll do. I don't care if the beast was known to be dead. I still do it. And any of you who refuse, why, you deserve to be eaten." The inhabitants of Dogren ran to the well. Loops were tied into the rope for footholds, and while the well was wide enough to lower 4 or even 5 people at a time, because they didn't trust the strength of the windlass, they lowered them in groups of only 2s and 3s depending on weight. Although people moved quickly and orderly, obeying Hadron's instruction without argument. With that argument, the process was excruciatingly slow. Magnus volunteered to go in and drive pegs into the walls to form footholds. Young Hal Arvard and Pearl, being too small to go down first, raced around the village fetching more shafts of wood for the dwarf to drive into the sides. Todd Baldwick went down and worked with Magnus, feeding him the wooden spikes as the little dwarf built makeshift platforms. "Well, mister," that's voice echoed out of the mouth of the well. "I ain't never seen no one use a hammer like that. It took 6 weeks to build up these walls, and I swear you look like you could have done it in 6 hours." Outside, Hadron Farron Vincent Dillon did the work of lowering villagers in Hadron, lined them up, sending women and children down first into the darkness, where only a single candle that Tad held for Magnus revealed anything below. "How long?" Adrian asked as they waited to lower the next set down. "It would have been here by now if it had flown the moment we heard it," Royce replied. "It must be searching the tower. That gives us some time. But I don't know how much." "Get up in a tree and yell when you see it." When everyone was in, Hadrian lowered Theron and Dillon, leaving only Hadrian, Vince, and Royce above ground, where they waited for Magnus to finish the last set of wall pegs up in a populatory. Royce stood out on a thin branch, scanning the sky while listening to the dwarf hammering the last stakes into place. "Here it comes," he shouted, spotting a shadow darting across the stars. Seconds later, the Galara brand screamed from somewhere above the dark canopy of leaves, and the three cringed, but nothing happened. They stood Still staring into the darkness around them, listening, another cry ripped through the night. The Galara Bryn flew straight for the torches of the manor house. Royce spotted it in the night sky, flying over the hill where the next challenger for the crown prepared to meet the beast. It descended, then rose once more. It issued another screech. Then the beast let loose a roar, and fire exploded from its mouth. Instantly, everything grew brighter as fire engulfed the hillside. "That's New," Adrian declared nervously as he watched the ghastly sight. The crowd of challengers lost their lives. With hardly the time to scream, "Magnus, hurry, all set, go, climb down!" The dwarf shouted back. "Wait," Ted cried. "Where's Pearl? She's looking forward, Vincent, or you get her." Adrian grabbed his arm. "It's too dangerous. Get in the well." "Royce will go." "I will." Royce asked, surprised. "It's lousy being the only one to see in the dark sometimes, isn't it?" Royce cursed and ran off, pausing in homes and sheds to call the little girl's name as loudly as he dared. It got easier to see his way as the light from the hill grew larger and brighter. The Galara Bryn screamed repeatedly, and Royce looked over his shoulder to see the castle walls engulfed in flames. Royce Hadron shattered. "It's coming!" Royce gave up. "Stealth, Pearl!" he yelled aloud. "Here!" she screamed, darting out from the trees. He grabbed the little girl up in his arms and raced for the well-run dam. At Adrian shouted, holding the rope for them. "Forget the rope, get down and catch her." While Royce was still sprinting across the yard, Hadrian slid down the coil. Thump, 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 hugging Pearl close to his chest. Royce reached the well and jumped. The little girl screamed as they fell in together. An instant later, there came a loud, unearthly scream and a terrible vibration as the world above the well erupted in a brilliant light, accompanied by a thunderous roar. Arista paced the length of the little room, painfully aware of Bernice's head turning side to side, following her every move. The old woman was smiling at her. She always smiled at her, and Arista was about ready to gouge her eyes as she was used to her tower, or even Hilford gave her space. But for more than a week she'd been subjected to constant company. Bernice, her ever-present shadow. She had to get out of the room, to get away. She was tired of being stared at, of being watched. After, like a child, she walked to the door. "Where are you going, Highness?" Benny's was quick to ask. "Out," she said. "Out, we're just out." Benny stood up. "Let me get our cloaks. I'm going alone." "Oh no, Your Highness," Benny said. "That's not possible." Arista glared at her. Bernice smiled back. "Imagine this, Bernice. You sit back down, and I walk out. It is possible. But I can't do that. You're the princess, and this is a dangerous place. You need to be chaperoned for your own safety. We'll need Hilford to escort us as well." "Hilford," she called. The door popped open, and the bodyguard stepped in, bowing to arrest her. "Did you need something, Your Highness?" "No." "Yes," Rooster said, and pointed at Bernice. "Keep her here. Sit on her. Tie her up. Hold her at sword point if you must, but I'm leaving, and I don't want her following me." The old maid looked shocked and put both hands to her cheeks. "And surprised you're going out, Your Highness?" Hilford asked. Yes, I'm going out," she exclaimed, throwing her arms up. "I may roam the halls of this cabin. I may go to watch the contest. Why, I might even leave the stockade altogether and wander into the forest. I could get lost and die of starvation, eaten by a bear, tumble into the mid-Walden and get swept over the falls, but I'll do so alone." Hilford stood at attention. His eyes stared back at hers. His mouth opened and then closed. "Is there something you want to say?" she asked, her tone harsh. Alfred swallowed. "No, Your Highness. At least take your cloak." Benny insisted, holding it up. Arista sighed, snatched it from her hands, and walked out. The moment she left, regret set in, storming down the corridor, dragging the cloak. She paused. The look on Hilford's face left her feeling miserable. She recalled having a crush on him as a girl. He was the son of a castle sergeant and used to stare at her from across the courtyard. Arista had thought he was cute. Then one morning she'd woken to fire and smoke. He saved her life. Alfred had been just a boy, but he had run into the flaming castle to drag her out. He spent 2 months suffering from burns and coughing fits that caused him to spit up blood for weeks. She awoke screaming from nightmares. As a reward, King Amrath appointed Hilford to the prestigious post of personal bodyguard to the princess. But she never thanked him nor forgiven him for not saving her mother. Her anger was always between them. Arista wanted to apologize, but it was too late. Too many years had passed. Too many cruelties followed by too many silences. like the one that are just hung between them. What's going on? Arista heard Thrace's voice and walked toward it. What's wrong, Thrace?